flip back and forth contrast between the medievals and the ancients. And he's really at this point putting several core ancient values under the vice to show how the medievals went directly after them. So I think today's discussion is going to be very interesting. I've shared the link up there. And for those of you who have not been on these calls before, this is a welcome to week 133 of our Kenneth Smith Millennia and Microcosm series of seminars. We are less than halfway through. We have probably another 3.5 years to go to get through this book. The book is called Millennia and Microcosm, and it's an attempt to show that the modern way of seeing the world is not objective and true, although it thinks it is. The modern way of seeing the world is one of many possible human perspectives on the world, and that it sees some things more clearly than other perspectives, but it sees other things less clearly. As with Gödel's theorem, every attempt to describe the world not only describes some parts correctly, it also casts a shadow over part of the world, making some things that are true disappear and making some things that are false seem to be true. And it is in the nature of these worldviews. So in this book, Kenneth Smith has us comparing and contrasting the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and the modern worldview. It's in 3 large parts. And the ancient worldview he deals with very swiftly in a single chapter, chapter 4, which we spent the first 2 years on, that and the lead up to it. And then the medieval and modern worldviews, he gives each of them a whole series of chapters. So we're in chapter 5. We're at paragraphs 13 and 14. Chapter 5 is introducing the medieval worldview, and it's doing it not as of what is it like around 1100 or 1300, but around what is it like around 300, 400, 500. What was the argument that the early church fathers were having with their ancient, pagan peers, and how did they go about trying to persuade people to give up the ancient worldview and to adopt what was slowly becoming the medieval worldview? And we see in this an illustration of the Hegelian model of history, in that the transition is not just a small incremental change, but is what Nietzsche calls a revaluation of all values. It's a complete inversion. It's a transformation. Things that were previously considered virtues are now called vices. Things that were previously called vices are now called virtues. And paragraphs 13 and 14 do a very good job of illustrating some of these points. So with that as our intro, let's just dive into the text and see what we have here. Starting with sentences 1 through 3 in paragraph 13, Christianity assaulted the ancient hierarchy of natural rank. And before I go on, a reminder, the ancient concept of hierarchy wasn't whoever's on the top is the good guy. It was nobody but a good guy should be on the top. And so when they were lying, they wouldn't say, do what I say because I'm in charge, haha, I win. They would say, whoever is the best person should be in charge. We welcome competition. Feel free to compete with us, but you'll find that there's a reason why we're on top. So they're promoting this concept of a meritocracy. The modern ideal of the meritocracy draws from the ancient ethos, and intrinsic in this is a perception in the world that equality is not the norm, diversity is the norm. The normal state of nature is that organisms are different from each other. Even members of the same species are different from each other. But especially between species, between different characters, we see people have different strengths and different weaknesses. I often like to cite the example of Sharon and her anesthesia, but today I'm going to go after Phil and say, Phil is an artist. I studied art in school when I was a kid, and I used to do a lot of art, but I haven't done it in decades. And so my potential to become an artist at the level that Phil is at was aborted when I chose other directions. I don't have enough time left in my life to become the quality of artist that Phil is. And to recognize that and say, look, Phil is just inherently better than I am at art, is not shameful. It's not politically incorrect. It's the natural truth. Anybody can see that it's the case. If they sit the two of us down at a canvas, the first half hour of activity will immediately make clear what an enormous difference there is. There is a
Well,
hierarchy.
well, it's a good thing you stopped because I would have to give up if you were into art. So
There is a, there, there is a natural hierarchy between Phil and me when it comes to art. And just like there's a natural hierarchy between Phil and me and Sharon when it comes to anesthesia, you shouldn't let Phil or me anywhere near the anesthesia controls. It would be a terrible, terrible idea, no matter how, especially if we really want to touch the controls. Slap our hands, slap us away, make us move aside, and let Sharon step up because she knows what she's doing and we do not. There is another natural hierarchy. And what you notice about this is that it's not the same hierarchy, right? Because I'm just guessing, Sharon, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that Phil is also a better artist than you are, just like he's a better artist than I am. It's just this is not my core competency. And Donald is a better programmer than Phil or Sharon. And we could play this game all day, right? This is what we see in nature. The cheetah is a faster runner than the turtle. There isn't a turtle anywhere to be found in the world that's a better runner than a cheetah. But on the other hand, a sea turtle is a much better swimmer than a cheetah is. There are all of these hierarchies, and the ancients believe that this is what nature is telling us as the ultimate authority for making decisions about right and wrong and how to structure civilizations. They believe that nature is saying it's important that there be diversity, that there be diverse excellences, and that just as nature has structured the many ecosystems so that all these different excellences can cooperate together and fit together into a great weave, what Heraclitus calls the hidden harmony, in the same way, human societies should be structured in such a way that there can be multiple excellences, multiple hierarchies, with people with different arete, different things that they're great at. And this is going to come up in paragraphs 13 and 14, especially in sentence 3 of this first paragraph here. That different people are great at different things, and if you try to arrange them into a single hierarchy, you make a disaster. Nobody's good at everything. Nobody has great judgment about everything, but different people have different strengths. And if you let them make the decisions in those areas, you're going to get a better quality of decision than if you let some Yahoo try to be in charge of all things. Or if you put it up to a vote and ask everybody what they think. This is also a disaster. You really want all the anesthesiologists to be making anesthesia decisions. You don't want to dilute their decision making with all the programmers and artists and all the other people with all their other excellences should butt out when it's an anesthesia question because they don't have the excellence to be qualified. And this is not their area. So when Kenneth says Christianity assaulted this ancient hierarchy of natural rank, he's not saying, oh, they kicked out the horrible tyrants who were keeping us all prisoner and now we're free. That's a modern, right, representation of what it means to defeat a hierarchy. To the ancients, defeating a hierarchy, assaulting a hierarchy means that you want me in charge of anesthesiology and you want Sharon to be doing programming, right? Which, oh my God, the consequences. You ever hear the joke about, do you want an Italian man to do this, and you want a French man to do this, and you want a British man to do that, and you want a German man to do that, and that's heaven, and hell is if you mix them up. I can't remember a German lover. It's like all of these things they become wrong when you put people where they don't have the excellences, and from the ancient perspective, Christianity's assault on the ancient hierarchy was the destruction of the possibility of excellence. Whereas from the Christian perspective, the hierarchy that they were assaulting was the late Roman Empire, which was corrupt. It was rotten to the core. And they were liberating people by getting this horrific parasitical structure off of people's backs, right? There's a difference of perspective of what's happening at that moment in history. And all of that, this is, for those who haven't been on our calls before, this is how Kenneth writes. Right? He doesn't have to say these things. He said them in chapter 4. He said them in chapter 3. He said them earlier, and you're supposed to bring those things forward. When you see a keyword like ancient, which is his name for the entire first of the 3 epochs, he's evoking all of that material that he said about the ancient world in chapter 4. And when he says hierarchy, he's invoking that specific part of chapter 4 where he talks about the hierarchical perspective that the ancient worldview has. And so what he's inviting us to not do is to not substitute in our modern definitions of these words, but to now that we're armed with the ancient worldview, substitute in the ancient perspective on these words, so that we can get to the core of the argument, which was between the budding medieval civilization and which was trying to grow up in the shadow of this gigantic ancient civilization, in which modern definitions have no place. Moderns wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. They weren't part of that argument. So Christianity assaulted the ancient hierarchy of natural rank. Natural rank, right? The cheetah's faster than I am. That is. It's not rank because he's using force to dominate me and pass a law and tell me that I have to, or cops will hit me over the head with a bludgeon. No, it's natural rank. He's alluding here to Hannah Arendt's writings in The Human Condition, where she talks about the nature of authority. So the difference between authority and coercion is coercion has to be imposed, but authority is something you can just, if you are sensitive, you can detect it, right? You watch the Olympics and you see the high jumper arch her body into the air at a crazy angle and get over that bar, and you couldn't jump over half that height in a bar, and something in you as a human being swells in your heart with admiration. You go, wow, that is the stuff right there. I am looking right at it, and it's amazing. That's the natural rank that he's alluding to here. This is what Hannah Arendt wrote about. It's like, I go to a traditional Okinawan karate dojo, and I've been studying, Okinawan karate all my life, but not full time. And I watch a little 5-foot Okinawan man do these amazing maneuvers and shifts of his mass. And I see him throw a 6-foot, 200-pound muscle bound dude, with ease. And my heart swells, and I go, oh man, I wish I had half the excellence that little old man has. He has a natural rank. It's not because he beats me up. It's because anybody with eyes to see and ears to hear can immediately feel the real authority, the genuine authority radiating from them, right? So all of this is what he's talking about in this opening sentence. These are simple little words. It's easy to gloss over a sentence like this, but he's evoking all this depth of material. He's doing it quite consciously. And I know he's doing that, and Donald knows it, and David knows it. It's part of why we, got involved with Kenneth Smith's philosophy. And part of the way we know it is he told us, right? In conversations, he said he went through a phase where he was dissatisfied with his writing. And he said he went back to the basics. And he said his use of language was too academic, too sloppy, too pretense of objectivity. And he said he needed a new vocabulary that was precise and that would be like poetry and stack an enormous amount of meaning in just a few words. He wanted to do what Nietzsche said Nietzsche wanted to do. Nietzsche said it was his aspiration to say in 10 sentences what some other writer would require an entire book to say. And then he follows up and says what he couldn't say even in a book, because it's too big. He wants to cram that into 10 sentences. And when Nietzsche says that, he says that as a Hellenophile, and he's harking back to gnothe seauton, 2 potent words, ethos, anthropoi, daimon, 3 potent words. He's finding phusis cryptis thai philae. He's finding this gnomic value system of pre-classical Greece, right? We're talking the 600s and 500s BCE, the time of Thales and Heraclitus, and all of these writers who are so focused on how can I say the fewest words possible that convey the greatest possible meaning. So we know because he's told us, and we know because it rewards this kind of unpacking. This is how to read Kenneth. This is how he writes. All of these words, a fair number of these words. You gradually build yourself a vocabulary list of what are the loaded terms. And when you see a loaded term, you stop and you say, I wonder if this is one of those moments when Kenneth is trying to fit an entire book into a word. And frequently the answer is, oh yeah. And the sentence gains additional meaning. It becomes a stronger sentence when you realize that's what he's doing. So Christianity assaulted the ancient hierarchy of natural rank. Phil, come off. You are off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have a question about the natural order and I guess the technical order. And because human beings have this sort of developed mind and we don't have the kind of instincts animal have, but we have technical competency in a way. So my first thought was when you were talking about, running and jumping and all that is, and you mentioned high jumping, and I remember a bit distinctly the form change, and it particularly changed with Fosbury flop. Okay, that is a technical invention of sorts because the original thing of high jumping was something like, it's kind of like a natural order. You jump off on a log because you're running and escaping. You want to do something in a natural world. But in high jumping, it's evolved to a point nobody in nature is going to do a Fosbury flop when a lion is chasing him. So that's a very, very particular thing that has nothing to do with life. It just has something to do with the particular skill, art form, or athletic form it is. So you could think of the same thing in terms of like, well, birds could fly, man couldn't fly. The guy tried to have wings and he hit the wax mill and he fell down. But now we have airplanes that could fly certainly faster and higher and whatever. To what degree is that technical order, which in a sense is beyond a natural order, it's a good thing and we're making progress beyond nature. To what degree is something like the Fosbury flop it's the bad thing? It's just like, oh, that's a discipline that has nothing to do with life. It's just an art form
Right.
of its own. So how does that work? I mean, it's like we have this thing what we manipulate technology's invention and we're very clever at doing that, but at some point it exceeds what nature is, sometimes in a good way, sometimes it isn't. So
Hmm.
that's a very important thing to keep sight of because
Yeah.
now when I watch jumping, I wish they in a way go back even to the Western row or or whatever. That was at least somewhat close to just jumping over a log, but
Yeah.
not the Fosbury flop. No, that's it.
Yes. Do you ever watch the shot putting in track and field in the Summer Olympics, like they just
Yeah,
watched it in
yeah,
2024?
yeah,
You know, you see these muscle-bound people toddle up to the center of their circle, and they're holding that huge thing in an odd, it's like right up against their cheek, and you're going, well, this is a little strange, until they begin spinning, and they
yeah,
start spinning slowly, and you're like, okay, and then it goes faster and faster and faster until, and there's a point in the spin when you're like, that is amazing that a person can do that. And the ball doesn't just come flying off sideways or hit him in the head or anything. It's like you can see the excellence. Or when you see these 14, 15-year-old girls on ice skates and they turn forward and swing their leg forward and go up into a triple axel.
yeah.
And you're like, man, I'm lucky if I don't fall over and I'm on ice skates. I can't imagine the amount of expertise and excellence that's gone into this. And so, on the one hand, you can see there is a natural component in it. And partially it's just the astonishing amount of practice and dedication that's just revealed in the movements. But partially in both of these examples and your example of the plane, there's a prosthesis, right? Man is the animal that needs a prosthesis to do most of the things that we do. And mostly the things that we don't necessarily need a prosthesis for are, language and acculturation, because language and acculturation are themselves a kind of biological prosthesis to fill in our missing sophrosune, right? To give us the ability to be interested in the right things, to care about the right things, to focus our lives on the right things, so that we're able to develop those excellences or develop those tools. When you look at this from the ancient worldview, our perspective on technology is very different. It's neither inherently a good thing nor a bad thing from the ancient perspective. From the ancient perspective, the question is still to be asked: does this contribute to sophrosune or
Hmm.
does it not? If it destroys sophrosune, or shall we say, when it destroys sophrosune, it's a bad thing. But when it advances sophrosune, it's a good thing. And it could be the exact same thing. So there's this way in which moderns are so obsessed with pragmatism. We want the gun. The gun is the important thing, it gives us power. But we're leaving off the question of, but who are you pointing it at? How are you using it? Is for Aristotle's, perspective, the whole question is not resolved until we get to, but how is this to be used? Whereas we think the question is over when it's like, yeah, I learn more, I'm more, knowledge is power. Yay, power's why wouldn't I want more power? Power is inherently good. The ancients are like, only in the cause of Sophrosune is power a good thing. It could be a hazard otherwise. So, come back 10,000 years from now and let's see how our airplanes did, you know.
Well, an irony to this is the Trinity site, right? It's interesting. It's called Trinity too, where they exploded the atomic bomb. It's
Yeah.
like, well, why is that called Trinity? I mean, it seems like, I mean, it has the power of God, or is it? They didn't understand that the Trinity is not about destruction; it's about sending you to hell.
That's that line they cut from a James Whale's film Frankenstein, right? By God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
Yeah.
And they're all like, nope, nope, there's going to be riots in the streets. He can't say those. He can't say that line. But that's the thing. When science gets to the point that you're handing people gigantic amounts of power, but you're handing it to people who have no character to speak of, then the power becomes destructive of Sophrosune. What does Dr. Frankenstein do? He abandons his child that he's created, and all of the ills, follow. Not so this is the it's easy to go, oh no, men should not meddle. It's like, yeah, but that wasn't really Mary Shelley's point. Mary Shelley's point is this guy has no character. He abandons his creature, and as a result, his creature is harmed and damaged, by his bad parenting and his bad character. It is we're back to Martin Luther King Jr., right? Judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What is the and character is relevant here, right? In this opening sentence, natural rank. Remember that character, ethos, character can also be defined as nature, and that the Greeks use the same equivocation of definition of the word nature that we use. It is both what is around us, but it's also within us. What is your nature? What is your nature is another way of saying what is your character? What is your ethos? And so he goes right from talking about natural rank, which is not just rank according to the rules and laws of nature, but also according to ethos. And the way Kenneth Smith means that is look 3 words ahead, comma, the aristocratic ethos. He goes right from nature, from natural to ethos. So he's making the tie that the ancients made between these words, nature and character and ethos. This is what we're talking about. What is the nature within you is the ultimate deciding question for whether something is going to be good or bad. And this is what he's going to explore in these sentences that follow. So thanks for bringing it up, Phil. I mean, it really is the open question on our species and our epoch and our technology and our sciences. To what end are we doing these things? Cui bono? So Christianity assaulted the ancient hierarchy of natural rank, the aristocratic ethos that showed its design, not just in the system of nature, but also in the striving of men. What is higher, to be excellent or to triumph over one's own ego and appetites? Oh, this is like this opening sentence of paragraph 13. You can tell. I mean, Donald, David, they could tell immediately. There's times when Kenneth just shoots from the hip, and there's times when he reworks and reworks and reworks a sentence to pack as much goodness into it as he can. And here he's managed to link nature and ethos and aristocracy. The reason he says aristocracy is to link it to hierarchy from the earlier section, because the hierarchy that we're interested in is not it's not an oligarchy. It's not just whoever gets in charge is in charge, but an aristocracy, which Aristotle defined as the opposite of an oligarchy, because an oligarchy is just some men of bad character who happen to wield power. Whereas an aristocracy is when you let yourself be governed by whoever among you has the best character, right? The aristoi. And in a modern definition, an aristocracy is an oligarchy. We don't make that distinction. And Aristotle says it is the very most important distinction to make in government. If you're not distinguishing Sophrosune versus destruction of Sophrosune, the hell are you doing? This like not distinguishing between food and poison. Here, eat this. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me if it's good for you. It's wrong. Be pragmatic. Just put it in your mouth and swallow it. Right? This is the modern approach. Don't ask where this is leading. Don't ask if this is good. Just do it. Right? Who have we elected? The man of the best character? The man of the worst character? A man of middling character? Well, the Constitution doesn't care. He must be an American citizen of a certain age who has not yet been convicted of a felony, and that's it. He can be the person of the worst character or the best character. The Constitution is absolutely agnostic on this issue. From the perspective of the U.S. Constitution, there's no such thing as sopra sune. It just doesn't matter. It's a non-thing. Why mention it? It's unreal. It's irreal. It's irrelevant. Whereas to Aristotle, it's the most important of all things. He goes back to it over and over and over, right? The compass in the brain that all the other animals and plants and fungi have that we're lacking. Which way lies our health? Which way lies our vitality? Where is the right thing to do for the long-term outcome for us as individuals, as families, as cultures, as a polis, as a civilization, but also for our species and for all life on Earth. It's all got to weave together to be sopra sune. If it's just I win but you lose, or I get to fly through the sky but we also add more carbon to the atmosphere, or there's any number of ways to look at the larger picture and say, yeah, it's nice that I was able to fly from here to there, but what was the cost of doing that? Did it lead to long-term sopra sune or not? And Aristotle would want to know the answer to that question, and moderns don't because we're pragmatists. So hierarchy to aristocracy, he's linking here. Nature and natural rank to ethos, shows its design, not just in the system of nature, we're back to nature and its hidden harmony, right? But also in the striving, the agon of Homo sapiens. What is higher, to be excellent or to triumph over one's own ego and appetites? And, in these calls, in these seminars to date, we've talked about, is Sisyphus being punished by having to push the boulder up the hill? Because after all, no lazy person wants to push a boulder up a hill. And even someone who wants to do work, why would they want to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity if he's never going to succeed? It's never going to win. It feels futile and people don't want to do a futile thing. But of course, from the ancient perspective, trying to overcome your own appetites and ideologies is pushing a boulder up a hill for all of your life. It's like an alcoholic learning not to yield to the siren song of the bottle, right? A song that bottle doesn't sing to any healthy person. It sings to the alcoholic, saying, "You drink me," right? Alice in Wonderland, right? You need me. You can't live without me. It's a special song. So what the ancients believe is that to the Aristos, there is a song that's being sung that is a song about you don't want to be a prisoner anymore of your appetites, but also you don't want to be a prisoner anymore of your ideologies and logical systems. You want to overcome these twin addictions in the way that the Homo sapiens mind is structured, that wants to pull us one way or the other. You don't want to be a prisoner either to your gnosis or to your noesis. You want to string them together in a polyntropy, into a dialectic in which you pit the two, faculties of the mind, the basal metabolic faculties of the mind, against each other to create a space within which to do something higher. So triumphing over one's own ego and appetites, would obviously be the higher goal from the ancient perspective, given everything we've talked about in the past 132 sessions before today. And yet, when people talk about aristoi and aristocracy and striving, how often do we call it the pursuit of excellence? Which he's saying here is not the same level of aristic endeavor as overcoming your own addictions. Stephen, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I will note here that it's the Christians, the people on the bottom of society, who are opposing aristocracy. Now, I mean, really, you got these guys crawling around the gutters, hiding in the cracks between buildings, telling us that our great leaders like the emperor, well, he's no better than me. How would these guys know? It's a bit like Karl Marx, you know, he threw his dice badly, or fate threw his dice badly, and he ended up on the bottom of society. Now, people at the bottom of society naturally think there's something wrong with the order of society. And this is your Christian through and through in the days when they were in the empire. Of course, after a few centuries, they wisely realised that having the emperor on your side was a very, very good idea. So I challenge the idea that we can value aristocracy from the point of view of those living in the gutter. I challenge that. How could that be the case? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. You know, and really what you've underscored there is why there would be a conflict in the late Roman Empire between the emerging medieval perspective and the ancient perspective, because the people on the bottom have had it. And it's not like they're at the bottom of, you know, classical Greek society. They're not at the bottom in Corinth in the year 450 BCE. They're at the bottom of the late Roman Empire, you know, 400, 300, AD. This is an era when it's not an aristocracy, it's an oligarchy, but it calls itself an aristocracy. There's a huge amount of hypocrisy and corruption. And being at the bottom is a very different phenomenon than it was back in the days when the Persian emperor was angry when he came to Greece, because looking around, he couldn't visually work out who were the slaves and who were the free people. They all dressed the same, they all looked the same. The only difference was the slaves couldn't vote. And he's like, this will never do. I need to see the slaves abased. I want to see them miserable so that I can pick them out in a crowd. And I want the free people to be covered in gems so I can pick them out of the crowd. I don't like this. You know, the only difference is who shall govern and who shall not govern business.
Well, put it this way, you know, democracy was an idea. You know, you're the Persian king and you hear of democracy. Well, I think they showed up on the doorstep of the fledgling democracy about 18 years after it's created. That's a pretty quick move, really.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
probably another aspect we can't overlook, and this is skepticism. In the rational age, which came with the turning point, so to speak, you know, the growth of empire, and that there was an increase in what you would describe as spiritual skepticism.
Right.
Not what we call a skeptic, but these skeptics began to doubt the validity of existence, the validity of life. Maybe it was something to do with being under the thumb of an empire. I don't know that in that regard, but Christianity was a remedy to skepticism. There was one great, huge, all-powerful God who could, once you get up there, he'll explain it all to you.
Yeah.
You know, if you feel any doubt about the value of life, don't worry. A mastermind has worked it all out for you.
Yes.
Now, put that against, say, well, let's say an atheist mind, which really, the modern atheists are fools, as Nietzsche's pointed out. Don't you guys realise that you've just told the population there is nothing guiding you? What's going on with you dudes? Have you worked that out? We'll be okay. We'll be fine. We don't need any guidance. We can work it all out for ourselves.
Right.
This is what happened in the 19th century. Nietzsche's blowing the whistle, and they don't hear. So yeah, we've lost the remedy to skepticism. There's this
Yes.
great big God in the universe who's worked it all out for you. And if you feel that you're struggling a bit, don't worry. This is just a challenge he's put in your way. And if you're a good man, you'll overcome the challenge and get to heaven.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Stephen. And this is a part of what's fascinating about the medieval epoch that we're getting into is this idea that it's rife with contradictions. And one of the core contradictions is, on the one hand, it's going to develop into one of the most orthodox, almost genocidal, well, straight up genocidal systems of government that Europe has ever been through, because its focus is on exterminating all of the religions through either conversion or conquest.
Don't worry about that. We were told.
Yes,
We
yeah.
know some of the good people will die in the exterminations, but don't worry, God will reward them in heaven.
That's right. The problem will be fixed later. Yes, yes. So on the one hand, there is this huge demand for faith, right? And it's also in the nature of the God that they're worshiping, because he's not the God of the ocean. You can't just go put your foot in him and go, well, this is obviously Poseidon, right? I mean, it's like, who could disbelieve in Poseidon? He's right there. Go try to launch your boat without any water, and you'll find Poseidon's all over you. He's all around you. These were very naturalistic deities. It was hard to have skepticism about. But the God who is everywhere and nowhere, and you can't just reach out and touch him, is a God that demands a different kind of faith. The act of faith becomes the center of the religion. Can you overcome the evidence of your senses enough in order to strengthen your faith? So on the one hand, faith is at the center, but at the other side, especially in the first few centuries, skepticism is the core of Christianity, because Christianity's core argument is none of your gods are real. And there's basically an infinite number of them, right? There's all these different cultures. There's polytheism in all of them, as far as they can tell. And you're saying, that God doesn't exist and that God doesn't exist. These are the first people to really do this on this scale. Say none of these gods exist except for one. So they're like almost atheists. They spend most of their time tearing down deities and proving that Thor's not real and Poseidon's not real and Jupiter isn't real, and like that keeps them busy for centuries. So they're wielding this tool and they're teaching people how to be great at this tool, and then they're saying, but you must never use this tool against the one God. That one is real. So don't ever, all those things that we taught you about how to disbelieve in gods, don't use that against this core God. You have to believe in him, but not believe in them. And of course, that's a contradiction, right? In the ancient world, they all believed in each other's gods. There wasn't that kind of gods don't exist thing was not the norm.
Yeah, but those gods can contradict each other. They might argue with each other.
They might argue with each other.
How can you build a universe with a committee?
Right, right. That's what you get, right? So there is this interesting thing in which the medieval revolution, on the one hand, unleashes a new era of faith like none that's ever been seen before, but also a new era of atheism like none that's ever been seen before, right? Because the Christians are atheists about all gods except their one. All these others don't exist. These are both new things at the level of intensity that are brought to bear. So thanks for bringing some of this up. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
What's on my mind is language itself, because you mentioned something that's deeply embedded in metaphors. And metaphors, of course, is a poetic language. But I want to start by saying, when I was in college at Berkeley in the early 70s, there was only two posters I had in my room. That was Bob Dylan and Malcolm X. Somebody said, well, that's kind of a strange mix. I said, no, it isn't. And I've been recently listening to some of Bob Dylan's songs. And I was particularly thinking when Stephen was speaking about the song Blowing in the Wind, written in 1962, when he was only 21 years old. I want to quote this, just part of it. It says, how many times must we turn our head to pretend we just doesn't see? And how many ears must we have before we hear the people's cry? I mean, yes, there's so many ways we could ignore things in a way. And it's just like Blowing in the Wind is interesting because I just saw a movie that almost seemed like blowing in the wind. It's like, on the one hand, when the wind blows, air is very ethereal. Like we're almost unconscious of it until it's blowing in the wind. And when it's blowing in the wind hard, I mean, it's in your face. You can't ignore it, right? But when it's just a gentle wind, you'll feel it, but it's not in your face, and it's hard to grasp. What is the wind saying that I can't grasp? That's a poetic idea, and it seems to me like when you were talking about metaphors, it immediately told me like, that we started with mythos and logos. It seems like those are the two important aspects of our human nature. Because when we became so rationalized, it's as if we forget the mythos part. And the mythos part is like the blowing in the wind. It's subconscious, but it affects our life. It's the basal instinct that's connected to nature, to all living things, have this sort of feeling in things. And it's not, and we have added on top of that reason, so we have these two ways of thinking. And the fact that we have, well, we haven't totally, because poetry's still alive, we have abandoned the metaphorical way of speaking, means that we have disconnected ourselves from the subconscious and unconscious that is trying to surface. And we feel like, oh, we got it all done. As much as I'm a very, very committed humanist, I feel like there's something that humanism has got wrong. Is like, because when the Copernican turn happened, we got the measure of measuring the whole world. The human being is the measure of all things. That's what the Copernican turn is about, We can measure the universe. We know we know how far the sun is from whatever, we know how the sun goes in elliptical, I mean, the planets go in elliptical units and all that. So we are measuring everything. And so the rationalization of that, in a sense, keeps us from actually covering over the sort of more basal part of our existence that's necessary. And it seems to me, to some degree, we have to, well, psychology is trying to recover that to a certain degree, not so much psychiatry, psychology. So in some sense, we have that, but it's in a kind of very funny state, because particularly of Freud. I mean, he has a funny relationship with psychology. I like Jung better, because he's connected to storytelling of some sort. So in some sense, we have to evolve that, and it's a good thing that we still have that. And it seems to me, at least in the late 60s and early 70s, throughout the 70s, I mean, like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez did a number. I mean, that in a sense waken us, our consciousness to a certain degree. And I think that relationship between that and Malcolm X, in which he actually does see and he actually does hear, and grasp it. I think that relationship, it's like I don't know. I don't know how I recognize that, but I had those two posters in my room. They were
Yeah.
the only two, right? Which is interesting. One speaking about poetry and things not seeing, and other people already, like I said, the wind is blowing them in the face. They got it, right? The rest of us is trying to grasp it. It's just so ethereal. We don't know exactly what we're grasping, but it's telling us something. The wind is telling us something. And so, okay, I just want to say the power of poetry.
Yeah.
I hope we can recuperate that to the
Yeah.
degree that deserve. That's it.
Thank you for that, Phil. Thank you. Yeah, clearly Kenneth believes in that. I mean, that's what he's trying to do with his language, is kind of philosophical poetry almost. And certainly the many of the philosophers he admires the most were concerned with that as well. The very next sentence, Or is self-overcoming, in Nietzsche's phrase, not itself the most difficult of excellences to cultivate? Nietzsche was constantly playing with language and trying to find ways to say difficult things in profound in a profound and meaningful way, in a poetic way. This is Walter Kaufmann's conclusion after renovating, Nietzsche's reputation by doing correct translations of Nietzsche and showing that far from being an anti-Semite, he was an anti-Semite. He hated German nationalism. He hated German anti-Semitism. He admired Judaism. He's like, Nietzsche was the opposite of what the Nazis tried to make out of him. Yeah.
Well, let me say something just a little bit more, because when you said that, what poetry does, what rationality is, you have to understand the logic, and you go, sentence, therefore, and so forth. What poetry means that you have to go internalize and actually, in a sense, I feel the thing and try to grasp it like grasping the wind. I mean, I think that's an important part of being internalize your experience and question yourself inside, not outside in the measurements of things. I mean, those two things are very important. The inner and the outer relationships is very, very important. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. So Kaufman says, having translated so much Nietzsche and then having translated Hegel, he can say there's just no comparison between the two. And Nietzsche is a devoted stylist. He's concerned with how the language feels in the mouth. What does it evoke? How does it move us emotionally? He says, whereas Hegel wields language, like an analyst. He's like an academic. He's just laying out his argument as however long it takes, and he's going to say it, and he's not particularly concerned with image. It's why he says it's such a rare moment when Hegel, in one of his footnotes, he says how much he detests thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as a description of his theory, and says, would that people would talk about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. And you're like, and Kaufman says, Hegel, just for a moment, there was poetry in your language. And it's one of the best things you've ever written. It's just you've captured so much of your system in this just the list of the three things and their relationships to each other. Poetry has this evocative potential that the ancient Greeks were obsessed with. So yeah, okay. So self-overcoming. So, what the second sense, or is self-overcoming, in Nietzsche's phrase, not itself the most difficult of excellences to cultivate? In other words, if there is a hierarchy, if there's a diversity among species, if there's diversity among excellences among people, then maybe excellence itself is not just an absolute, that's exactly the same, excellence is excellence. Maybe there's hierarchy among excellences, and some of them are easier to acquire, and some of them are harder to acquire. And the harder ones are the rarer ones, and so he says, to what extent do we see people, what he's about to compare is Achilles to Priam in that powerful scene from the Iliad, where Achilles in his wrath has slaughtered Hector and then violated all the rules of war and human treatment by dragging him, 7 times around the walls of Troy behind his chariot until his body is just a ruin. And it's so core to the ancient Greek ethos, the treatment of the dead. That was core, as Gilbert Murray says in 5 Stages of Greek Religion. It was so central to Greek culture because that was partly how they made their peace with the people they conquered in the Hellenic Peninsula. They said, we will treat your dead as reverently as we treat our dead. Your holy places where you've buried your ancestors, we will venerate just like we venerate where we have buried our ancestors. And that's how we will become one people. Even though we've conquered you and now you're slaves and you have to do what we say, we're still going to be one people because we're going to hold the same sacred together, our ancestry. And that is one of the most fundamental, it's one of the most fundamental rules of Greek society. And here is Achilles violating it in the most horrific way possible. He's just destroying the individuality of Hector's body. And he's doing it in a huge public way, in a spectacular apotheosis. And in that moment, what Homer is showing us is Achilles having lost his humanity. He has pursued courage and excellence in battle too far beyond the human until he's behaving in a way that is inexcusable. And yet still he doesn't return the body. And so Priam is just dying inside that his son is being treated this way. And he has to sneak into the Greek camp at night and go begging to Achilles, to beg him, please, please, please give me back my son's body because I have to bury him. And he has to ask this of the very man who not only slaughtered Hector, but then did the most unforgivable thing. And he has to appeal to his humanity. And at the point that Nietzsche alludes to, and that Kenneth Smith is really addressing here in these first three sentences, is that for Priam to do this, it's not just about humility or humbling himself. He has to overcome his own ego and appetites. Because what would you be feeling towards the man who did that to your son and then to your son's body, right? He is full to overflowing with feelings. Very, very, very difficult feelings in that moment. But he has to perform an emotional alchemy and transmute that into a message that even Achilles, in his bloodlust of the moment, in his wrath, that this chapter of the Iliad, the chapter of the Trojan War that this is often titled "The Wrath of Achilles." Achilles out of control, he's raging, and so this man has lost control of himself, and somehow Priam has to control himself so much that he can reach through that rage and re-find the core humanity within Achilles that will make him want to be a better human being again, to remind him of the better angels of his nature. And as a number of writers have noted, that Hector, not Achilles, is the hero of the Iliad. So Hector behaves so much better because Achilles goes in with all the force and all the power, and yeah, they're having a hard time winning, but too many of the gods are on his side, and he's blessed by the gods, and he's got divine lineage, and he's got the oracle that says he's going to, be the greatest warrior who ever lived, and blah, blah. All this stuff is going for Achilles, whereas Hector is on the side that did the wrong thing, but can't seem to dig their way out, and they're up against these horrible forces, and he's the greatest fleet that ever sailed. And Hector is the lesson about the nobility in losing. When victory is not one of the options on the table, how do you teach your culture about excellence and about self-overcoming? And so Hector has to master himself and behave like a better human being than Achilles. And Homer makes the example as crisp as he possibly can by showing Hector bravely going out into these hopeless circumstances, trying to do the right thing, trying to bolster the morale of the people, and remind them there's more than just this war at stake. There is, how are human beings to live in the future? Who will set the example for how human beings should treat each other? So you got that on the one hand coming from Hector, and on the other hand, you've got Achilles losing his mind with rage and throwing tantrums, and he's like, yeah, you might be the greatest warrior ever, but dear God, you are a mess. Your character is a mess, right? You're not behaving in a humane fashion. You may have the combat skills and the courage that people might want to emulate if they're going to learn to be courageous and disciplined in battle, but you don't have the whole package because you're kind of a monster, man, and we don't want people to behave like you. So this is why Homer pits these two against each other. And this is the subtext that's going on with Priam having to abase himself on behalf of the defeated hero and the hero who was basically molested. His body was treated in the worst possible fashion, and he's got to somehow bridge the gap between these seemingly polar opposite characters to bring them back together and find a common humanity. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for the explanation, because it really made the connection with Sophocles' Antigone. I mean, the Greeks all know about Homer and the Iliad. So when they saw Antigone, it's happening all over again, right? I mean, but in a worse way, because whereas Achilles was an individual act that violated a structure, uh, what Creon did was to institutionalize that. And that means it's a state sanctioned relationship. So that becomes much more powerful, just like racism is much more powerful and much more terrorizing when it's institutionalized. And when it's institutionalized to a certain degree, it it becomes almost some ways invisible because it's just part of the system, man. Don't you understand, right? Whereas like an individual, you can say that guy's a fucking bastard, right? I mean, like that's different. So when you institutionalize it, it makes it really difficult to devolve away from it. So I mean, so I am surprised that he got away and won the war for criticizing the institution, you know, by expanding Homer into something that is now structural. Now
Right.
that I want to thank you for that revelation. No wonder it's such a powerful play, you know, and it's like it was it was more important that Oedipus Rex in the 19th century because people understood the
Yeah.
institutional relationship. Yes. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for championing Antigone on a regular basis. I mean, this is my year to reread it. I reread Agamemnon last year, and oh my God, what a great play! But it's Antigone and also Oedipus at Colonna, the two neglected of the trilogy. Everyone talks about Oedipus Tyrannus, and they always skip past Antigone and Oedipus at Colonna. But I'm going to be rereading both of them this year, thanks to you and your championing of them. They do have just as much meat and depth to them as Oedipus Tyrannus. So here's a quote from the Iliad, and I'm putting this in just as an allusion to. I'm trying to make explicit the allusive nature of Kenneth's writing. You know, this is what he does. He's constantly alluding to other texts, and it's well worth not trying to race through Kenneth's text, but when he makes a reference to something, go look at that something and you'll see why it's in here. Tall Priam came in unseen by the other men and stood close beside him and caught the knees of Achilles in his arms and kissed the hands that were dangerous and manslaughtering and had killed so many of his sons. And when dense disaster closes on one who has murdered a man in his own land, and he comes to the country of others, to a man of substance, and wonder seizes on those who behold him, so Achilles wondered as he looked on Priam. Right? Priam shocks Achilles, the unshockable Achilles, by putting himself in Achilles' power. A godlike man, and the rest of them wondered also and looked at each other. But now Priam spoke to him in the words of a suppliant. Remember your father. Right? So the king of the mighty power of Troy that for 10 years the Greeks haven't been able to beat abases himself and puts himself in Achilles' power solely for the sake of reminding Achilles of his basic humanity and his duty to return the body. And he doesn't say you're a terrible man who has done terrible things and you should be ashamed of yourself, because that absolutely would not reach through the fog of rage, the wrath of Achilles. He instead, by example, demonstrates what it is to be a humane human being who focuses on the sacred things. The treatment of the dead is sacred. It's not that Achilles has broken a rule, it's that Achilles has violated the sacred. These are two different things. Moderns living in an era in which nature has no significance and the gods are a hobby one goes and deals with on Sunday mornings to expiate one's conscience for the horrible things one has done to one's fellow human beings the rest of the week. You know, this is a characterization a number of people have made about what religion and nature mean to a modern. You know, very little, right? And after the medieval period, you had the dominant orth, not the many interesting people on the sides who wrote and were so influential, but the dominant hierarchy is one of obedience. obey those who fight and those who pray. Those who work, we have to work and shut up and do what you're told. These things, they don't, they prepare one to think about duty in terms of obedience. Thou shalt, or else eternal torture, eternal damnation. This isn't authority. This is coercion. This is the fist, right? Threatening. And it's why in the medieval period, there is this tug of war between the central orthodoxy, which might use the brand of love, but is constantly using the threat of, the great armies that are amassing, thus the Crusades eventually. But even under Charlemagne in 800, how are we converting Europe to a Christian country? By the sword, right? Charlemagne is going out and slaughtering the heathens and burning the sacred groves, and he's stealing all their gold and bringing it back to Rome. And the Pope loves it so much that he crowns him, Holy Roman Emperor. It's like, yes, this is what we want. Genocide is what we want. We want you to eliminate the pagans. They can convert or they can die, and that's their option. So in this context, as heirs to 2,000 years of this tradition, it's natural for us to read this as thinking Achilles has broken a rule. There's some rule somewhere, either imposed by a god or by a king or by a legislature, but there's a rule, and by breaking the rule, Achilles needs to be punished. And this is how our justice system works, right? We don't believe in restorative justice. We don't fix things that are broken. We just punish people who did bad things. That's how we structure everything. And from the Greek perspective, this makes no sense. And you can see this in this showdown between Priam and Achilles. And Priam has an entire army at his command, but he doesn't send the army out to deal with Achilles. And he has all the moral force on his side because Achilles has done a terrible, terrible, just humiliatingly awful thing in front of the whole world. But that's not the focus that Priam brings to bear. Priam does what Martin Luther King Jr. does. He says, let's talk about our basic shared humanity. Can you be a mensch? Can you remember what it is to be a person? What did your father teach you? How would you feel? How would your father feel if you were the one who died on the battlefield and your body was mistreated? Imagine his tears, his grief, his shame. He makes Achilles feel his own humanity, and it brings Achilles out of the fog of wrath so that he remembers what it is to be a person. Let's see if this will all paste in. I'll just paste this next thing. Oh, it is all going to fit. Fantastic. Okay, so another little part from this, and again, the use of language, the way that Homer focuses us in reading this exchange between Priam and Achilles. It says, Priam says, I put my lips to the hands of the man who has killed my children. So he spoke and stirred for his own. So he spoke and stirred in the other a passion of grieving for his own father. He took the old man's hand, pushed him gently away, and the two remembered as Priam sat huddled at the feet of Achilles and wept close for manslaughtering Hector. And Achilles wept now for his own father, and now again for Patroclus, right? Achilles' best friend who was killed on the field of battle. And this is the main source of the wrath of Achilles. He's finally able to transmute that rage into grief. And because he's feeling grief, now he can empathize with the grief of Priam because of their shared humanity and their shared loss. The Buddha is here, right? Compassion. There's compassion here. The sound of their mourning moved in the house. Then when great Achilles had taken full satisfaction in sorrow, and the passion for it had gone from his mind and body, thereafter he rose from his chair and took the old man by the hand and set him on his feet again, in pity for the gray head and the gray beard, and spoke to him and addressed him in winged words. Ah, unlucky, surely you have had much evil to endure in your spirit. He is amazed that Priam could go through all that pain and then come abase himself in front of the man who caused it. He's finally able to appreciate the profound act of character that's taking place before him. He had to get through his wrath and then into the grief that he wasn't willing to admit to himself before he could dilate his heart and be a human being again. So Priam has had to overcome himself in order to find a way to reach, but be authentic with Achilles, so that he could reach Achilles to such an extent that he helped Achilles overcome himself as well and rediscover the lost humanity within himself and become the better person that he had lost for so many passages in the Iliad. This is the act of an Aristos. This is the pushing the boulder up the hill. And this Aristos, and this is what Donald is always talking about, Kenneth saying, this Aristos has reminded that Aristos how to be an Aristos. He's reminded him by example. Achilles' just experience of being in the relationship with Priam and secretly in this tent has brought Achilles back to what it means to be an Aristos, which he'd lost, right? In all the earlier books, his struggles with Agamemnon, the frustration, the jealousy, the petty tantrums, and ultimately the rage at the loss of Patroclus. And the rage, of course, is because it's partly Achilles' own fault because he wouldn't fight for the Greeks. And it's for that reason that Patroclus had to go out in disguise in Achilles' armor. So there's shame and guilt in Achilles as well that he's hiding from himself. But it's only when all that's opened back up by the exposure to the behavior of a real Aristos that Achilles, who has lost himself so profoundly, can re-find himself and become a better human being. And the whole exchange changes directions. Self-overcoming, right? As Nietzsche says, the most difficult of excellences to cultivate. And when Nietzsche says that, it's not just because Nietzsche thinks that, it's because Nietzsche is a classicist who's immersed in these Greek stories. He knows this story backwards and forwards. And so, Nietzsche too is thinking of these lines and these passages. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, it's so good to be here. First, to show some gratitude. I have marriage. I have a marriage between gratitude and pretty much just experiencing things positively, which is kind of what this mythos is as well. And it's the experience nature that I wanted to focus on here with Priam, and that he doesn't come to Achilles and try to give him some rational, sophist argument of why he should do it. He really gives a very human experiential. Yeah, he uses some words, but again, it's more like poetry. Remember your father. To me, I understand mythos as more like seeing identity and meaning through narrative and not and the implicit, rather, as more was Phil was saying, rather than the logos, which is the explicit. He doesn't do something explicit and just say you should do this because of this, this, and this, and this, right? That's not going to reach him. He goes for the mythos, and I feel like Homer is really driving this home, that when we want to be persuasive and when we need to be persuasive, we have to use the mythos of really highly developed character to demonstrate what it is to have character. And then this showing of example, this experiential nature of learning, rather than this rational, abstract, symbolic, representational nature of learning. And he in order to do, it's interesting to really provide a mythos model, which is probably why I'm going to hypothesize here, why our modern culture doesn't embrace mythos, and for so long the perhaps the medieval era also really rejected this idea of mythos, is because it requires an Aristos. It requires someone of truly excellent character behavior who has really cultivated the self and overcome the self and sees the value of quote unquote, pushing the boulder up the hill. And it's not really at all the plain text, or even I've ever heard anyone explain the value of pushing up the boulder of the hill. But the idea is also that pushing up the boulder up the hill over time actually creates a path in the hill. It actually changes the hill ever so slightly. And if we do this one at a time, all of us, we each make our tiny little mark. And another way of looking at this is seeing reality in terms of like a boulder coming down the hill, back down. The fool tries to block the boulder and just gets run over by it. And the coward just completely avoids the boulder. And the Aristos nudges the boulder ever so gently when it might make a small change. And I feel like there's this metaphor is really powerful in terms of cultivating character, that what aspects of our character we can do. If it's like something we want to do, I need to learn how to become more capable of handling difficult, stressful situations, right? And I can't do that. Well, I need to imagine that future me could do that, and that I could take a process one step at a time. With that which seems impossible now could be reflexive later. And this idea of cultivation through a relationship of time is much more of a mythos perspective than a logos perspective. This is not something that you can just convince someone who's never seen it done. They need to experience an Aristos, someone who is of modeling in experience, to really make that feeling and knowledge in a more experiential way rather than some abstract way that you could then question or doubt, or as Stephen put, have a bunch of skepticism towards. You can't be skeptical of something when you see it and you experience it. It's much more powerful, I think, in that way.
Yes. 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 I mean, I agree. That this is that thing that if we get too caught up in the intellect, we start to think that logical, rational arguments are the main way that the history moves forward and that our lives get better. And we forget that it's not. I mean, it's nice to have a good argument, but it's the power of the experience of living the life that compels us. It's what underlies all of our intellect. We're persuaded by things because of the unconscious feelings and associations we have. And, it's part of why the mystery religions of the ancient Greeks, like the Eleusinian mysteries or the Orphic mysteries or the Pythagorean mysteries, they were focused on, yes, there was discussion of what it meant, but above all, there was immersing someone in a powerful experience, because experience can be transformative in a way a logical argument cannot be. It's like, I use the example a lot, and I overuse it, of the first time you go to the Grand Canyon, you're standing on the rim looking at it, and it blows away every video or photograph or it's a written description you ever had. All those representations are just shattered by the immensity of the experience of being there and hearing the sound of the winds and the huge quiet and the unbelievable scale of the place. It's the experience of it has a potency that no representation of it can possibly have. And that's what Priam's doing here with Achilles, is he's making him re-experience the heuristic way. And it is, Achilles was raised to be an Aristos, just although he lost his way in this war. And he can't resist wanting again to be that better person. Once he's really been given back the experience of it, it pulls on him, it draws him. I think too about, in the U.S. we've got this church that was constantly sending picketers to the funerals of gay people, and they would go there with signs saying he's burning in hell, God hates fags, blah blah blah. I mean, these guys, Westboro Baptist Church, right? And nobody could get through to these people. Would argue with them, people would yell at them, and none of that made any difference. Well, one guy became I think it was a pen pal to the daughter of the head of the church, and for years would sustain this correspondence with her. And in the correspondence, he didn't yell at her and he didn't make logical arguments. He was just concerned about her and how did she feel and what was her life like. And eventually she left the Westboro Baptist Church and stopped picketing at people's funerals, because the experience of being in a relationship with a loving relationship, it wasn't about sex, and it wasn't about boyfriend girlfriend stuff, but it was about basic humanity and being reminded of what it's like to be in a relationship like that, side by side with, on the other hand, the really cold, abusive, harsh relationship with her father. there's something in the human heart that says, given that choice, if I really believe in this choice, if I don't think it's just a trick, I want the humane thing. I want the fulfilled life. Why would I want to continue in the wrath of Achilles if I have the option of the shared grief with Priam? Because of course the reason that Achilles is so enraged is because he has a grief in him and a shame that's so strong he doesn't know what to do with it except to go forth and kill. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh yeah, I've been fascinated by this idea of compassion. Seems a pretty weird idea to me, really. These ancient cultures seem to have been what they called the honor culture. And these were not terribly compassionate cultures. We see Schopenhauer, of course, famously has a very bleak assessment of man's place in the universe, but he emphasizes compassion, and yet Nietzsche viewed this as weakness. Nietzsche is propounding the honor culture again. So I find compassion not a strong one for me. It seems to me that it's the idea of a familiar relationship. You might feel compassion for one's own social group, and that's necessary, or you don't have a society. One has to extend the familial obligation to something broader like a society, or you're just not going to have a society. But extending that to the whole of humanity is the issue, which is so beloved of the modern rationalists, which I disagree with a bit. But I mean, Achilles is taking the opponent body and punishing it. He's punishing his memory. He's punishing everything. He's reducing the body of his opponent beneath the level of humanity. This is just an animal. I am proving I am greater by triumphing over this one. So how does this particular fashion, this affection for compassion arise? Not a strong one with me, so I'll be interested as to views on the nature of compassion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm not going to try to do justice to it now, and part of the reason why is it's going to come up over and over and over throughout this medieval section. You've got 2 years in which compassion is laid out as the theoretical, emotional core of the Christian religion, and so it'll give us a lot of chances to talk about comparison and contrast with Buddhism and so forth. But what is useful at this moment, I think, is just the only thing I'll put in this is, we have to be cautious when we think about, ancient, and this might. Maybe ancient Greek isn't even the right word here. Maybe archaic Greek. Maybe the period of the Mycenaeans and the Trojans is not the same epoch as the epoch that includes classical Greece and the Romans. I don't know. Nobody's very clear on this. They might be 2 different epochs. But at any rate, regardless of whether we're talking about one or the other or both, I think as with any other powerful term, like freedom or character, right, or God or nature or man, we have to assume that to them it means something radically different than it means to us, and radically different than it means to the medievals. These are different epochs with a different value system. So you can see examples of performative compassion all over the place in the ancient Greek stories. And performative compassion is very different from, like, the ideal of Christian compassion is supposed to be, it's got to be all the way down into your soul that you feel for the other person. It has to be authentic, right? But performative compassion is the idea that there are things that you should do and you're required to do them because it's sacred to do those things. And there's things you should, sophrosune includes not just phronesis, knowing what you should do. It also includes sophron, which is knowing what you should not do. Knowing what violates the sacred, in that these are things that we do not do, because if we do those things, we have set ourselves against the hidden harmony of the cosmos. We set ourselves against the gods. And it's not that they'll punish us. It's that now that we're out of harmony, we're going to get run over by trampled by the elephants and so forth. So examples of performative compassion among the ancient Greeks, aside from what we're seeing right here in this passage in the Iliad, the most classic example is that Zeus said, when a stranger comes to your house as a guest, you have to treat them well. You have to treat them well. You have to. And not because I say it's a rule, but because this is how the cosmos works. And societies that don't have guest right, societies that don't honor guest right, in which the host takes advantage.
We've still got the honor elements here.
Yes, I know. This is why I'm saying performative, right? Their honor is tied up with their notion of compassion. But they're saying those who don't honor it are setting themselves against the way that nature works and against the way that the sacred works. And surely catastrophe will follow. This is the naturalistic ancient argument about compassion. When there are things that you must be compassionate about, it's not because you'll go to heaven if you do those things, or because you'll go to hell if you don't do those things. It's because this is the structure of nature, that there's certain kinds of compassion that are necessary. So, for example, why is it wrong that Procrustes tortures people to death on his bed to make them fit the bed? Why does Theseus kill him? Well, they're violating he's violating Zeus's rule, or shall we say Zeus's observation about the necessity of guest right? Likewise, Deucalion and his wife, they're the only two spared from Zeus's flood. And they're spared from Zeus's flood because Zeus disguises himself as a poor, crippled man and goes from house to house in the town, and everybody treats him poorly except Deucalion and his wife, who treat him, they don't have hardly anything, but they treat him brilliantly. They give him everything they have. And so he spares them from the destruction of all of their friends and relatives. Because those are awful people, but the two of you have remembered that you have to treat people well. Because you don't know who those people are. You don't know what their connections are. You don't know the consequences of your actions. And if you were the one who was hobbling through town poor, you would want someone to treat you right. There's a certain kind of performative honor bound.
We still have self-interest at work here.
Yeah, I'm not telling you they don't. So this is a kind of compassion that's different from the kind that you're worried about. There's a self-interest that isn't about pragmatism, right? It's not about, do you have any excess you feel like sparing? Because Deucalion and his wife have nothing. I mean, they have, it's very clear in the myth. They have nothing, and they're giving what they have to him. It is not practical for them to exercise proper, duties as a host, but they do it anyway, and it pays off. So this doesn't boil down to self-interest that a human being can detect. This is what puts it into the realm of the sacred. It's saying there is a self-interest that has to do with being in harmony with natural law, and there will be long-term good consequences, even if you can't see what they are, even if you can't calculate them out, even if it's not apparent to you. Do it anyway. You'll be sorry if you don't. And it's a theme that runs throughout the Greek myths. I mean, I just gave a couple examples, but I mean, I could do a dozen of them if I had an hour to prepare. There's so many from the Greek myths. So there's something here, I want to say, in ancient culture. There's a kind of compassion that is very different from Buddhist compassion, very different from medieval Christian compassion. It's very different from modern compassion, but it is a thing, and it's not something we've spent a lot of time on before. But you can see it in action here in this exchange between Priam and Achilles. It's all bound up with honor and shame and natural law and all these other things. So it has a completely different character than the other kinds of compassion. But they would have called it something like compassion. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks. I wanted to share a hero of mine. Really, you'd almost call him a rabbi, except he's not Jewish. But it's really an Aristos. And many of you are probably familiar with him. His name is Daryl Davis, and he's a black musician and author who spent decades engaging with the Ku Klux Klan, and through essentially compassion, but through dialogue, and genuine curiosity and a sense of really cultivation, he convinced many of them to denounce their ways. And I find it's interesting that I was looking up his book. The name of his book that he wrote is called A Black Man's Odyssey in the Ku Klux Klan. And it almost really relates to this ancient idea of mythos versus logos as a way. And then quickly, I wanted to offer what I understand as the modern Jewish way of interpreting the ancient version of compassion, which is primarily that you learn compassion by doing, and then by doing acts of compassion that you don't understand, it leads you to actually feeling compassionate. And so there's the idea of charity being obligatory. You have to give charity to people, and the specific people that are often noted are the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. And it's often said it's best done anonymously, but with your attention on the fact of what you're doing, being really focused and being present to what you're doing, and this idea of really that your attention or your humility is also an act of charity, that your attention that you're giving, and it's to some degree trying to cultivate an aristos of being able to do the role reversal. And it's specifically the language in the Bible is oftentimes doing this because you were a stranger in a strange land, basically the idea of being slaves in Egypt. And therefore and when God took you out of this, now you're obligated for all time to remember this as the basis of your origin story and your identity, and that you should never forget what it is like to be a stranger, or in this case, similar to a widow or an orphan, that's someone who is completely dependent or destitute. And you should not have this sort of pity attitude that you're superior to them and therefore you have power and you need to use your. No, 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 no. This is just an idea of practice, role reversal, and I think this is where the idea of compassion or empathy really comes in, by engaging in the attention of spending time with these people. It's an act of mythos more than logos, that you're really engaging in the experience of the behavior, which is compulsory. So you just have to, and it starts with the logos idea that, oh, you have to do this and you don't really know why, which is an interesting twist on sophorsune, of the opposite of the modern thing, which is, oh, you have to eat something, it's good for you, eat your vegetables, and later you'll find out why they're good for you. But it's like eating your vegetables leads you to appreciate how good the vegetables are for everyone involved. And so, but the key idea here is, rather than I feel like doing something, so I'm going to do it, you do something, and that leads to the cultivation of the feeling.
Yes. Thank you, Ari. Yeah, we won't get to the bottom of it today, but I'm glad Stephen brought it up, because it's a recurring theme, and not one that I have done justice to in the previous 132 sessions. Kenneth doesn't highlight it in chapter 4, but it's a recurring motif in the ancient world. But as Stephen sort of implies, and as I want to underscore, compassion means something very different to the ancients than it does to us or to the medievals. And it just struck me while Ari was talking, so I put it into the chat, that it was Stephen who asked very early on in our sessions about centripetal versus centrifugal when it comes to civilizations. And of course, this is what I found in F.M. Cornford's writings, both about the emergence of Greek philosophy from Greek religion, his book on that, and also his book, Thucydides Myth Historicus. When he talks about philia and nekos, the Greeks saw philia and nekos as opposed to one another. And philia wasn't about love or eros or all the things that you see it translated on as in the modern world. It's not even brotherhood per se. That's a Christian notion. It is the forces that pull together a polis or a tribe or a clan or a family into a cosmos. I should have written into a cosmos. Philia and cosmos are directly aligned to each other. The hidden harmony of nature is the philia of nature that makes nature into a cosmos, right? Without that philia, there'd be no cosmos. By contrast, a group that is dominated by centrifugal forces is at the prey of nekos, which is the force that turns a group into a chaos. And the Greeks believed, to the bottom of one of the core premises of their civilization, is the reason that they deserved to rule over the indigenous people that they enslaved is that they had philia that allowed them to operate as a cosmos when their opponents were only able to muster the behavior of a bunch of fighting individuals. They were a chaos. So chaos versus cosmos goes right to the heart of the Greek proposition of what it is to be an Aristos. And it's all centered on this concept of philia versus nekos. So the compassion to be thinking about here from the Greek perspective is not Christian compassion or Buddhist compassion. It's philia. It's the compassion that makes it possible to operate as more than just a bunch of individuals squabbling in a chaos. That's what they're looking for. And yes, Nikos in the modern world, of course. To someone like Aristotle, they take one glimpse of how we run our governments or economy or anything else, and they'd be just like, wow, I'm surprised you're still here. I don't think you'll be here much longer. What a chaos you have. Nikos is everywhere. You're trying to somehow make a civilization out of Nikos. That is not going to work. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This the interesting thing about, I guess, mythos and logos is that, having studied to a certain degree the Republic, Plato's Republic, and now I'm sort of in a group that's looking at the laws. Seems like education is very, very fundamental to developing a society. And there are different stages of education. It seems to me that the very young, before they could even develop reason, you teach them to dance, to sing, to essentially do what is kind of a musical kind of thing. And so what that does is to create a sense of relationship and harmony. I mean, harmony is a very, very important word. That in a sense, things relate to each other so that in a sense, eventually it becomes a symphony of relationships that works together. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes music so fundamental in our lives in many ways, because it prepares us to, in a sense, receive the logos, because it creates the mythos underlying structure. And so when the kids grow up into, I don't know what age, but let's say they're like through elementary school or halfway through, maybe the third grade, maybe the fifth grade or something, they could begin to handle arithmetic. I mean, not deep mathematics, but arithmetic, right? And which is the beginning of rationalization in a sense. So, but you can't rush that. I mean, you can't, well, maybe for a few exceptional kids, you can't teach them mathematics, except maybe very rudimental counting, and or even teach them the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you have to sing it. So in some sense, that sets the stage, which essentially does. I don't know how the Greeks uh, understood this, but they seem to understand that's a reason. But that has something to do with evolution. They didn't have the idea of evolution, but they seem to understand at that stage, whatever it is, there's a developmental aspect of that. And harmonies, I don't know if I told this story before, but when I went to uh, teach at Youngstown State, I went through the art committee and the whole bit, but the dean, I had to go, interview with the dean. The dean actually tried to throw a curveball at me. He threw that he thought I would balk because, I'm after all not a musician. I'm an artist. I'm a painter. So I'm sitting down. He says, "Well, Phil, tell me what the difference is between painting and music," right? Which is a hard thing to answer when you're not a technical musician. But I happen to love music, so I have some at least feeling understanding of it. I said the problem with visual arts and painting in terms of representation is that because over 90% of our contact with the world is through our eyes, it's a very, very functional tool. We need it to survive in order to not bump into trees and hit the rock or whatever it is, right? Ears are, on the one hand, sensitive enough, but not so sensitive that we depend on it. at all times. Sometimes we depend on it for survival. So it doesn't have the kind of minute precision understanding it needs. Because of that, music has an advantage because what art has to do is to take that and deconstruct the utilitarian aspect of it in order to push it down into a kind of, well, I didn't say mythos, but into a non-functional art form so you could relate it and internalize it and push it outward. And of course, the Renaissance did the opposite, but nonetheless. So in that sense, we had to do this extra work of violating the visual perception in a sense to allow it to be kind of abstract in a way. I think what music does is you're very, very lucky that because of the non-functional thing, I used the word at that time, maybe I should switch it, but not music exists in a floating world. So it's totally internalized. It floats it in your interior. So therefore, the creative element is always within the feeling aspect of it already. So that's one of the reasons why music is so powerful. You know, when I took my vocational test, I actually scored higher in music and the love of music than in visual arts. But I was so bad at it, I said, well, you know, like I can't give up. I can't do this thing, you know. Plus, I think my musical understanding was so high. If I started at 5, maybe everything be different. But you know, like if you ever listen to like elementary, you know, orchestra or junior high school orchestra, those people who teach them are really, really humanitarian heroes because I could not put up with this dissonance until they learned what the hell's going on. And so, you know, like I think I was in that stage in which I couldn't bear to hear myself become an elementary person practicing that. So I gave it up, you know, and I gave it up because I only had talent in the visual arts, you know. Otherwise, maybe I would have done it anyway, despite that. I was too old to relearn that language. So I think music is deeply connected to mythos in a funny way. Okay, that's it. The symphony is in a sense the harmony of all the relationship. Once you learn that, you begin to say, "Oh yes, you know, the weaving of the, you know, of the traffic relationship. Oh, that's a harmony, you know." And sometimes you complain because they don't got the stoplights quite right because now it's stopping at every stoplight, you know. So so somebody who's in the traffic control, they have to have that harmony and that relationship between, you know, the parallel and the vertical relationship so they function at least in an efficient way. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. See, Sharon
So
wanted something.
I just wanted to endorse what Phil said, and it's an experiential endorsement. One of the great things about getting old is that you can look back at your life. So Phil, I had a father, and education was the path to excellence. That was his mantra. And I came of age, in addition to which I came of age playing 2 musical instruments, the violin and the piano. And I excelled at the piano. In fact, in retirement now, I have started again and I'm part of a group and I'm doing very well because I went all the way through. I almost got to the stage where I would, that's what I was telling you, Rick, where I was going to be, do the final degree for music, but instead I went to medical school.
Right.
But in school, mathematics was my forte. And I'm listening to you, and I didn't quite make that connection, but I was first all the time, right? And because I can't remember not ever playing a musical instrument. He sat us down from we were like 3 or 4. We all played. So I was really interested when you said Aristotle said education was the way to hone a society, because that's what he believed. And I think I'm the benefit of that. So thank you for that. It's an observation that I didn't put all the pieces together.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, that notion of a symphony is really interesting. I mean, it takes Heraclitus's hidden harmony, I think, in the direction that Heraclitus meant it, which is it's not just a single harmony because you've got all these different archi, each of which is a source of order, and it's the interactions of all of them and how do we weave ourselves into that larger structure. That's more symphonic than it is simple harmony. You know, we're not talking plain song here. We're talking, you know, Beethoven's ninth or Mahler's second. You know, I had an opportunity to go riffing on what Phil was saying. I had an opportunity to introduce a friend to Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection, for the first time a few weeks ago. And there might be people on this call who don't know it. Mahler was famous as a sort of weirdly lopsided composer. He didn't work in most classical structures. He did songs and song cycles on the one hand, simple ditties, you know, but they're pretty, but just songs. And on the other hand, symphonies. And he didn't write anything in between. There's no sonatas, there's no concertos, there's none of the usual stuff. It's either symphonies or it's songs. And his symphonies are huge. And so for his second one, he decides he wants to depict, you know, all of the meaning of the resurrection in a symphony. This is only a second symphony, but if you get a great performance, and particularly there's a number of good ones, but I'm a fan of Herbert Blomstead with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Blomstead is very careful about getting his strings to be precise. And it's important because this symphony, if you've never heard it before, you know, find yourself a copy on YouTube or somewhere else and turn the volume up. And it starts out with these trembling strings, and then you're overwhelmed by the impression that suddenly all of the cellos and basses, they go at exactly the same time, making syllables. I mean, you can't escape the impression that you're listening to the words of God, and it's in a language you don't know, but it's huge and resonant, and it's saying something. Da-da-da-da-dun, da-da-da-da-dun, da-da-da-da-da-dun, da-dun, 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 dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, da-dun, 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 da-da-da-da-dun, da-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. It sounds like speaking. It sounds like speech, but you know, somebody with a voice like a mountain, you know, and it's very precise, and it speeds up and slows down, and that is exactly what Mahler was after in it. If you were trying to make a rational argument about God and the resurrection, you'd lose all the atheists and you'd lose all the non-Christians right off the bat because, you know, it's pushing the resurrection, although he was Jewish, which makes it a strange thing for him to be composing. But as an experience, and this is what Phil was talking about, rather than a rational argument, as an experience, it's irrefutable. It just has this enormous power. It's incredible. And I didn't grow up knowing it. I didn't get to hear it until last year for the first time. And I completely fell in love with it on that basis, you know, that experiential basis Phil was talking about. It's symphonic. I can see you wanting to add something, Sharon.
Yes, I was going to say the power of music, particularly in your formative years, middle school and high school, all depends on the context. I went to religious middle schools and religious high schools, and we played a lot of hymns and a few classical pieces, but a lot of what the final sound was depended on the conductor, right? And she was more able to bring it together because the context was so well defined, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. And this particular symphony, more than many of them, really suffers if the strings are not absolutely on their marks. I mean, they've got to be able to, all those cellos and all those basses have to be able to hit exactly the same moment and move through those syllables fast and slow down and speed up. And if there's any slop, you know, if it's like most symphony orchestras where they're close but not quite on, then it just completely no longer sounds like you're listening to the voice of God, right? I mean, now it's just a bunch of strings struggling along. So, you know, that how much are you in sync with the hidden harmony thing? It really pays off. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, in the decline of political relations in the US, something I took an interest in 20 years ago when I noticed how the US was entering the phase that's similar to the decline of the Roman Republic. Now, many people are noticing the similarity, but I wasn't so brilliant. Oswald Spengler had pointed it out a century ago, that this is what was happening to Western culture. But one of the declines in relation to what I understood as a kid, and you see this quite rife now, but I remember Maxine Waters, when she stood up in front of a crowd and she was displeased with the politics of the other side, and she said, well, we won't stand for this. And she was telling the crowd, you must harass them in their daily life. They go to a restaurant, harass them. Around their private home, harass them. And this is overcoming, this is where our form of democracy respected the right of the private individual. You could disagree with them in the political arena, but it didn't extend to their private life. And this seems to be something you get a bit from Karl Marx. Karl Marx had that feeling of revenge against the bourgeoisie, that sacredness of society, of the private individual and whatever. There's no longer the private individual, as I think was said in Dr. Zhivago. That's history now. You're just an object. I noticed a guy was making an interesting point that when you look at the fascists, they built on Marx. They just, like Marx himself, they just changed some of the terms. Marx replaced Hegel's spirit with materialism. And he's pointing out, well, you read one of Hitler's speeches, this is TIK, and he said it sounds a lot like Marxism, only he's rearranged some of the terms. He's taken out bourgeoisie and replaced it with Jews. And actually, when you look at Hitler, he despises the capitalists. Hitler's saying all the time, it's the common working man of Germany is the man. And he despises the people of wealth and so forth. And he pointed out, well, really, Hitler was quite serious when he called himself a socialist. So it's this interesting thing to watch for, is this translation of values. That what we're seeing in Western politics today, well, maybe American politics, is, well, they're trying to look for a new lowest common denominator. You know, I was sort of born to a society which had a slightly higher common denominator on behaviour or belief in behaviour. And this, of course, has become the question now, that if you have this sort of vicious politics, which appeared in Europe a century ago, us Anglo-Saxons, or we still kept going a bit longer. But this Nikos, as he called it, already appeared in Europe with the First World War. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I've read the first half of Gore Vidal's series of novels about U.S. history. Anyone who hasn't read them, you might enjoy them, even if you're not from America, because Gore Vidal has a real gift for character and story. I mean, he believes in the classical way of storytelling. But one of the things that comes through in that, and one of the things that he said about it, is that they may be fiction, but they contain more truth than most U.S. history books, because he reads all the private letters that George Washington ever wrote or received, which no other historian does. And he includes all that stuff into the, behavior of the people. And so among the things that are in the letters are the number of complaints about riots. The United States was never a civilized place where, people respected privacy. It's like people were constantly fighting each other and knocking down each other's headquarters and invading each other's homes. And Australia, I could entirely believe that Australia was a more civilized place in the past. But what I'm learning from history is that the United States was never a more civilized.
Well, that's the British Empire, old chap.
Yes, this is what we get for kicking the Brits out. We became a bunch of dickheads. It's like, you know, we're whatever Marx might have contributed to modern resentment. We were a resentful country long before Marx started writing. It's astonishing the number of times the first 3 or 4 presidents had to duck and cover and run out of a place because a mob was coming for them. We're just, it's remarkable. Um, yeah. I think, Kenneth's line on this is that more civilized places in the modern world, what they're preserving is, he says, modernity, and we'll spend more time about this when we get to the final 2 years of this seminar, that modernity acts like an acid bath, and it eats away at the traditional relationships between people and their church and their family, their neighbors, and so on. And it tries to reduce everybody to isolated monads who can be manipulated easily within the market. And places that had more culture together, where they had more of a sense of we're a single people with a single culture, they get eaten away more slowly because they've got more in common that they're fighting for. Places that are more of a melting pot, like the United States, where people came from all over the place, they have less of a common shared culture, and as a result, they dissolve in the acid bath faster than those other places. And he likes to contrast France with the United States. The French are very touchy about their language, for example, and the Americans like to mock them for this, but the French are actually concerned with maintaining what it is to be French. And there's like, if we don't maintain what it is to be French, why bother existing at all as a people, right? Some other country should be here in our place. It's like our job is to have a specific identity and culture. And when they do that, Kenneth says it's a very contra-modern thing. What they're doing is they're preserving fragments of the old pre-modern culture that they had. And they're doing an anti-modern thing, which he's not against. He's just observing it. But places like the United States, we on the voyage over, we already tore apart most of our relationships with each other, and once we got here, we just sort of melted into the melting pot. Anyway, we'll we'll get more into that cheery topic in years 5 and 6. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's something is, it's pretty interesting how this all kind of came together, is this idea. I'm thinking about it in terms of like pulled apart kind of relationship in the hierarchy that you actually started with today. And just thinking about the idea of compassion within that framework. And, I thought it was actually very interesting what Ari had mentioned, is the idea of doing the right thing. Doing the right thing first is a way of learning. And that within that process is kind of that understanding, is that you start to have to reassess, because you start to think about what is it that pulls us away from each other. So there has to be a reassessment, a continual reassessment, which is like kind of returning to nature. And if you're returning to nature from that perspective, you kind of have found that hidden harmony, that that compassion, and that's really how you overcome the self. And what that does, and the reason this is relevant, is that there's that natural hierarchy, and then there's the unnatural one that you spoke about. And the unnatural one is the one that actually creates, there's a distance. It creates essentially almost a disharmony between individuals. Whereas there's a natural harmony that's actually there's less of a power distance, and there's more of a connection that's made. And what happens is, one way or the other, that's going to be rediscovered. And it's just a question of how painful it'll be. But I think that that's, the interesting part about doing the right thing is that we start to just discover the hidden harmony from doing the right thing. But there is an assessment, obviously a self-assessment, but the bigger thing is that you start to see the whole of parts relationship, and that kind of prevents the hierarchy from getting out of control, from becoming that unhealthy, unnatural hierarchy. Anyway, that's just it's interesting to see how this all ties together. And I actually thought that the examples of Prim and Achilles was actually very good. So that was a good example of that. Anyway,
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's interesting in how many disciplines do you first learn how to do the right thing without really understanding why. But once you know how to do the right thing, a whole new level of learning becomes possible, in which we can now go back and look at what you've learned and say, but why do you do this and not something else? I mean, it may feel natural because you've learned it now, but look what would happen if you did this other thing. Which, if before they know how to do anything, the unnatural and natural feel equally strange to them. The whole era they're trying to learn is strange to them, and they can't make these distinctions. But once they have like in traditional Okinawan karate, they say, there's sort of at least seven passes you have to do over each kata of learning before you've mastered it. I'll list a couple of them just real quick. I mean, pattern, do you have the basic moves in the right order? But then form, for every move, do you know exactly, is your fist supposed to be lined up with your shoulders? Is it supposed to be lined up with the edge of your body? Is your right shoulder forward and your left shoulder? There's all these little metrics you learn, but those don't do you any good until you know the pattern first. You have to have the general movement so you can correct it. And breathing, when do you inhale? When do you exhale? Eyes, which way are you looking? When are you tight and when are you relaxed? Is tight, no tight? So there's all these seven different things. But you have to learn the pattern first. Because all of them depend upon having the basic thing to look at and critique and analyze. If you try to get into the details first, they get lost and they never pick up the pattern. Nothing feels natural to them. And so this is sort of what it's like, to learn the heuristic way of life. If you're growing up in a culture in which there are aristoi always around for you to look at and observe, then you can get the intuition, which is what the pattern is in traditional martial arts. The general shape of things you can get in place, and then it puts you in a position where you can go back and critique it and understand it in depth. But if you grow up in a modern culture where there are no aristoi, we have no examples of what it's like to live that kind of life, then we're always grasping at straws when we're trying to understand how is an aristocracy any different from an oligarchy. I mean, we sort of, at some level, as moderns, we're programmed to believe it's impossible that there could be a difference. An aristocracy, of course, an aristocracy is nothing but a snooty oligarchy that thinks it's better than everybody else. Of course it is. I mean, that culture of resentment, we're bathing in it from the time we're born. And it's because we've never seen an alternative. So it's like you can't believe that somebody can do that high jump until you watch someone do it. And then it defeats all rational argument. You're like, wow. Now that I've experienced it, I believe it just happened right in front of me. I can't argue with it anymore. So this is that theme we've been talking about, and it's that thing that we see in this interaction between Priam and Achilles. Achilles has been spending his time around Agamemnon, who's a dickhead, and so he's having whittled away from him, worn away from him, his faith in the possibility of heuristic behavior until Priam comes and as a supplicant. It's interesting. I that theory that there's only a certain number of stories that have ever been told, and every story is some variation on them. One of the ones that's on that list is supplication. And supplication is a story that was told all the time in the ancient world, and it's almost never told in the modern world. And it's almost never told in the modern world because we don't, what is Priam appealing to? He's appealing to Achilles' experience past experience of the heuristic life. And if it's not there to appeal to, you try to make that appeal to a con artist instead of to Achilles, Priam would fall flat on his face and wouldn't get anywhere. A predator would look at Priam and go, "Yes, a supplicant, so now I can kill you. Thank you for delivering yourself into my hands." The idea, and this goes to what Stephen was saying about ancient compassion, the honor that's tied up in the concept of the ancient life makes it so that Achilles can't possibly kill Priam when Priam has so abased himself from a modern perspective, seemingly unnecessarily or unpragmatically. But it works in the ancient ethos. The story of the supplicant works in the ancient world. And it's a story we've lost because it's appealing to a basic humanity, whereas we've got nihilism at our center. We believe in pragmatism, whatever you can accomplish that gets you what you want. And supplicants have no role in that other than to be exploited. So it's interesting stuff, this role of how much are we talking to each other through experience versus rational argument. I don't know if I've got your name right, so correct me if I'm wrong. Akshat, come off mute. And oops, sorry, I accidentally muted you again. Go ahead and come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you said it correctly. Akshat or AK, whatever is easier. I just wanted to touch on what Phil said before about the visualization of art and versus music, and I wanted to say maybe I should be a bit envious of people that have synesthesia, but also this concept of how there are actually six senses, but people tend to forget that depending on which culture you come from. I know like the ancient Egyptians believed there's like thought as the sixth sense, including Hinduism, if I'm not mistaken. And if you add that element of thought into the six senses or five senses, then you come up with like, okay, most people are overthinking things or perceiving things through thought. And then if that's the case, could you theoretically have synesthesia with thought and mix that with any other senses? Like what if people started touching things and thinking things or vice versa? Or there's like literally 6 into 6 combinations, right? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Akshat. Yeah, I have a friend who has fairly pronounced synesthesia, and it's always interesting to talk with her about what life is like. I have very mild synesthesia. I taste colors, but not like she does. Hers is very strong, and she's autistic, and so it can be overwhelming for her. But what you're talking about is rife throughout this passage in the Iliad. Because this is about the experience. Giving Achilles the experience of Aristeia rather than trying to make a rational argument to him, and it turns out it was the only way to reach him in this story. Given where he'd been put through all his frustrations and grief and rage, it was the only way he could re-find himself is through that, what you're describing as the sixth sense. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, what's on my mind is several things that I'm a little confused, but I think I'll start with, well, I want to mention Mahler later after well, maybe I'll mention it right now and then get to the other points. One of the things that you helped me understand is Mahler's relationship with song. Now, and then symphony and all the other in-between stuff he skipped over. I mean, Mahler is one of the few, if not the only one, except maybe Beethoven in the Ninth Symphony, that actually incorporated voice into the symphony, right? And in particular, the songs of the earth. I love that. I love that. The reason why that's not a symphony, he didn't call it a symphony, is that's actually his Ninth Symphony. He understood that because he's kind of a little superstitious because Beethoven died after the Ninth Symphony. He wanted to skip over the Ninth Symphony and call it us Songs of the Earth, right? And that's a beautiful incorporation of that. And what I like about it is it's about the relationship between song and being on Earth. I mean, and the Earth itself. So that's it. I always love that symphony quite a lot. because that is his Ninth Symphony. Of course, he didn't escape that. Then later on, he wrote the Ninth Symphony, and he ended up dying after that. So the superstition went on. The other thing I want to go on is like okay, I'll mention this because that's also kind of interesting development. I want to say is that the way you're saying about the relationship between mythos and logos, or what Ari said about doing things and developing a habit, and that eventually gets you into the thing. So it becomes a relationship between what came first, the chicken or the egg. Right? So in some sense, it makes me think there really is a much closer relationship. The relationship between what's his name? I forgot his name. The British guy, and Kant. It, I got to remember his name, but
It's okay.
anyway,
Talk around him.
Is it Hume, Phil?
Hume. Yeah, Hume. Hume and Kant is a lot closer than we imagine, because Hume essentially is saying all of that is habit. You know, in other words, Kant just categorized the habit. So which came first, the habit you develop that becomes, in some sense, the category that became Kant's categories, and made that categories in a sense a link rather than just a kind of like a kind of more of a sort of emotional relationship between the habits. So that's interesting. So that makes the connection. In other words, Kant transferring the sort of like feeling being in the world into a categories makes it kind of like an interesting relationship, of shifting it to a kind of conceptual relationship. The next thing I want to talk about, it relates to that, is the relationship between Jane Austen and John Austen. I don't know either of them stuff well enough, but Jane Austen obviously sense and sensibility, right? Human beings have sense, they have sensibility, but that seemed more like an internalized relationship about being in the world and relating to others in that sense. John Austen obviously took advantage of that and created, J. Austen using that relationship. And he developed what's called sense and sensibilia. In other words, he's making a connection between the internal and the external in a way that in the world there are things that are receptive to the sense, is made for the sense. So there's actually a external relationship that's connected. So the fact that the total representation of the world is in some sense too abstract, because we think a representation, we see the experience phenomenologically, but that's already an image. And how do we get that into a category, so that we could, in a sense, reconstruct the world and make, in a sense, a Copernican turn, that we actually give life to the external world. I mean, which came first? The world itself, that we, in a sense, the apple give us, and we have the representation apple, and we give the meaning to the apple in the world, because without our understanding that the the apple would be nothing. It would just be whatever it is, just pure matter. But in some sense, but if there is sensibilia, then there's already a direct connection, as ethereal as it might be. So the sensation that's coming in is not just a representation, but it's already partially got the material that we relate to. So there's a direct connection between experiencing nature and there is a reality. It's not just a representation. Oh, that's a tree, that's whatever it is. So in some sense, there is a link between the external and the external. So it's interesting. And and then I want to connect it to Robert Irwin, which is a very, very important Southern California artist. Most people misunderstood Robert Irwin. They think he's a conceptual artist, which means he projects his ideas into the world. And he keeps saying, no, I create these images to, in a sense, experience them. And what it is that he wants to, he made this observation that was very, very interesting to me. Bishop Berkeley, if a tree fell in the forest and there's nobody to hear it, is there sound? Right? Because sounds require the receptivity of an organism that could do it. And he switched that argument around. He says, if trees never fell, would there be human beings? In other words, we became who we are because we keep running in the forest and trees kept felling, and we experience that, and we develop in coordination with that sensibility of the world being there, right? So in some sense, you could say the chicken came first and then the egg. I mean, in a way, so in a sense, now in a modern world, because things are changing, he wants to create structure that you experience, that it becomes internalized, rather than you conceptually develop it, and so people understand what the idea is, which is very different from, the conceptual artist. Okay, so I think that connection, I kind of believe that there's a connection, because when I go out and paint in nature, I do believe that I am painting that. I'm not creating a representation and make the tree behave as I would have it behave, although I deconstruct it, so it makes it internalized. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. So that relationship is very important to me. What is the relationship between, even if we go back to like the ancient Greeks, phusis, I mean, something did appear. It's not as if, like, oh, all these colors, we don't understand it. I mean, like, we do have at least some primitive relationship to what things are.
Yeah.
So there is a direct connection in some sense. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. So going back to the text, I'm thinking of Sharon. Going back to the text, in at paragraph 13, sentence 3, he gives us the example of Priam and Achilles, and I've shared that text that we could, it was juicy text, right? I mean, we've had a lot to say about it. He shares another example, and I'm not going to share any text from this. I actually know it better. I know the Odyssey better than I know the Iliad. I read it at a younger age. And that's when Odysseus, in theory, has finally succeeded in the thing he's been struggling for 10 years to do, which is to get home. Only his journey's not over because the damn suitors are all over the place and they're harassing his wife, and he has to figure out what he's going to do. And he figures out, with the help of the goddess, Athena whispering in his ear in that way that the archaic Greeks thought that the deities did, he figures out that he can't go in to his own home as Odysseus. He has to go in disguise as a humble mendicant beggar. He lowers himself, full as one of the only survivors of the Trojan War. Most of the Greeks died on the way home or after they got there, like Agamemnon. He's certainly the only survivor from his crew that made it home. You would think he'd be returning in triumph. I mean, it was his idea of the wooden horse that led to the victory, right? And it was one of the greatest military victory of all time, and he's majorly responsible for it. And yet he can't come home in triumph. He has to come home mastering his pride. He has to come home as a mendicant beggar in disguise to figure out what the heck is going on and how's he going to reverse his circumstances and finally be reunited with his wife. But I'm not gonna share any quotes from that. I leave it as an exercise to my fellow seminar participants. If they haven't read the Odyssey lately, it's well worth doing. It's another potent sequence. So let's move on to where he's going with this. That ethos of natural rank manifested itself in the prerogatives of the ancient gods as well, right? And I'll get to the rest of the sentence in a second, but what he's talking about here is, again, we're still talking about nature and character and ethos all bound up together. We're talking about hierarchies and aristocracies versus oligarchies. All of that's still bound. He's using the terms, right? And he's talking about this core concept that we have about the ancient world, that to the ancients, nature is the highest source of authority, not the gods. Nature first. The gods and the sacred come next. And they come next because they are manifestations of nature that human beings, if they know what's good for them, will attend to. Things we have to watch out for, things we have to respect. If we don't respect them, we get trampled by the elephants because we're the mice in the grass. So the first nature, then the gods, and then man at the bottom as the one who needs to harmonize his individual choices and his cultures and his societies with the larger weave of the sacred and with nature. Which the sacred is an illustration of. So there's a hierarchy here. It's in there, and it is the classic example of the eristic harmony, because the gods are supposed to be better than we are. You know, they are our superiors. That is what defines them in part as being sacred. And what makes them our superiors is not because they say so or because they punch us in the face if we don't do what they say, but because they are beings who lack the worst of the limitations that mortals have, right? They are deathless, so they lose that aspect of mortality. Their creative works survive, so they lose that aspect of mortality that humans are plagued by. And they're not as stupid as we are, right? The three things the lyric Greek poets complained about what it is to be immortal. They said, God, it's terrible that we die, but it's even worse that our creative works don't last, right? Shelley's Ozymandias, right? That is such a Greek concept in that poem. The lone and level sands stretch far away beyond the ruin that's bragging about, I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Like, yeah, not anymore, buddy. Neither did your work survive. But the Greeks say, worst of all is that to be mortal is to be so damn stupid. Because we're creatures of a day. We wake up every day having forgotten most of what happened yesterday and having to rediscover it. And we live such short lives, and we pass on so little of our generational insights to the next generation. And so it's like running in sand. The momentum of trying to do better as a mortal it's frustrating day after day, year after year, and it's frustrating generation after generation. New generations fooled by things that old generations had figured out you shouldn't be fooled by. And here we are back to being fooled by it again, going, how can we not have learned this lesson of history? And it's because we're mortal, right? So what defines the ancient Greek deities is that they're not that dumb, and they're not so fallible, and they can make things that last. They have the three virtues we wish we had, right? It's not just about living forever. That's the modern reduction of the concept of a Greek god. It's not just that they're powerful. It's not just they live forever. It's that they're not as stupid and they can make things that last. So there's a natural hierarchy, and that's what he's alluding to here. That ethos of natural rank, the character that makes natural rank natural and not a coercion, that makes it an authority and not a coercion. I put a reference to the essay, What is Authority? By Hannah Arendt is in her book Between Past and Future. If you ever want to read her critique of the difference between coercion on the one hand and genuine natural authority on the other. And it's all over his writing here in paragraph 13. He respects Hannah Arendt. It says, and it is here that Christianity's theological core shows mutant elements that defied the comprehension of ancient minds, for it proposes a holy God, the Father, who cannot suffer at all, which to the ancients was bizarre. Because even Prometheus can suffer. His liver's torn out every day by the eagle of Zeus. It's not people that make him suffer, it's another god who makes him suffer, right? The gods can certainly hurt each other. I mean, in the Iliad, they drive Ares from the battlefield. And he weeps, sobbing. He runs to his mommy. How did the Greeks feel about Ares? Well, they were much more skeptical about Ares than the Romans were about Mars. That's for damn sure. They held him in contempt, and it's shown when he runs to his mama off the battlefield of Troy. The gods can be hurt, the ancient gods, because they're not all powerful. And also, they can be hurt by nature. if they violate the laws of nature, if they try to violate the laws of nature, they lose their authority, because their authority consists specifically in harmonizing with nature better than mortals do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be gods at all. The concept of a god who creates ex nihilo, the medieval concept, to the ancients, that's not a god at all. Nobody can do anything ex nihilo. You have to do it within the framework of nature. And if you try to violate that framework, you're cast down for your hubris, right? This is what happened to a god as much as it would happen to a mortal in the ancient context. But here we have a new religion that's emerging, that's inverting this value system and saying, no, it is only by casting down the framework of nature that one is worthy of being called a god. And of course, that destroys these subtle relationships of harmony and symphony, to use Phil's term, that are just rife throughout this concept. So it proposes a holy God who cannot suffer at all, even in the ways gods suffer from their peers or from natural necessity, ananke, right? The second most important Greek concept after sophrosune is ananke, necessity. And who sends his sacrificial son to suffer in ways no ancient god would or could ever have suffered. The first time I read that, I was like, aren't you contradicting yourself, Kenneth? Like, you're just saying that the problem with the Father is that he doesn't suffer. It's like, no, he suffers in ways that an ancient god wouldn't have suffered. And among the ways that he suffers is he suffers at the hands of human beings. That a mortal can crucify a god and kill him is not only not something that the ancients thought of, it's something the ancients thought of and rejected. And how can you be a god if a mortal can kill you? That's, to an ancient, that's not a god at all. But to the medievals, it's necessary, right? Because the son humanizes the father and makes the religion more grounded in compassion and all of these warm things that our Christianity's claim to fame as it's emerging. To the ancients, the gods are transcendent over human actions, beyond our reach. But Jesus, bound and condemned, is executed by crucifixion like the lowest wretch, an excruciating fate. And of course, excruciating is from the Latin for cross. So Kenneth's making a little pun here. Executed by crucifixion like the lowest wretch, an excruciating fate reserved for thieves and traitors. He's treated like the worst of the worst. And this too is a weirdness from the ancient perspective at the heart of the Christian religion. Because the ancient religion, you don't find people dissing Poseidon. Nobody says, psh, that Poseidon, he's not a god. Everybody can see he's a god. I mean, all you have to do is look out at the water. It's bigger than you are, it's stronger than you are, it's more changeable than you are. It will totally sink your ship if you don't respect it. Nobody, treats it like a thief, or it treats Poseidon like a thief or a traitor or something worthless. Even Ares, who they detest, they still have to respect, because the power that war has over the Greek world is something the Greeks are all too aware of, which is why they make the catastrophic Trojan War their national epic, to remind themselves of the disaster that happens when you don't respect the power that war has over human beings. So all of these are examples of, the ways in which there is a natural authority to the Greek gods that to them is essential to the concept of being a god. Like in the Hannah Arendt sense, the authority that the gods have isn't something that they insist on, or they punch you in the face if you don't pay attention. It's that anybody can see. Aphrodite, anybody can see the way somebody who otherwise has his act together can completely wreck his life over attraction. He falls in love and acts like a fool. We know these stories backwards and forwards. Nobody would say it never happens. It's obvious that it happens. That's the nature of the divinities they worship. They're obvious divinities. Even when they have subtlety, like the complex relationship between Apollo and Dionysus, nevertheless, there is a obvious authority. The concept that human beings would look on someone who's actually a god and not be able to tell that they have authority without that person going in disguise. I mean, Zeus disguising himself as a beggar, that's one thing. But Jesus didn't disguise himself. That was really what he looked like. But somehow human beings looked upon him and didn't see a god. They saw a thief or a traitor or someone who deserved to die. And to the ancients, that's incomprehensible. How can nobody recognize him for what he is when he's not even going in disguise? How can that be a God? All of the definitions have gone topsy-turvy, Kenneth Smith is saying. And the early church fathers aren't doing this by coincidence. They're relishing their teardown of the framework of the ancient concept of the sacred. They're going right for the throat. Every major proposition of the concept of religion in the ancient world is being deliberately assassinated by the new religion and saying, you know, your things aren't even worth worshiping. Our things, which you never would have imagined worshiping, are the only things worth worshiping. You've got it completely backwards, say the medieval church fathers. Phil, what's on your mind?
What's on my mind is the concept of ex nihilos. Somebody who knows more about mathematics than I do, I mean, historically speaking, could answer this question. I know the Greeks did not have a zero, but I believe they had negative numbers. I mean, even the early Greeks, but I'm not sure. Which means that zero is particularly ex nihilo, being a nothingness. The nothingness was a very funny concept because the negative number means the potentiality of becoming a positive number. It seemed like is realistic. So the ex nihilos either come from the balance book of ledger systems in which you keep in the marketplace. But it seems to me the zero seems to be an abstraction that's interesting because they did have scales at that time. It seemed to me at the market, you know, like if you have a scale, it's balanced, maybe as a line that, in a sense, is not tilted one way or the other, might represent the balance between the negative numbers and the positive numbers. Maybe that's the way they should do it rather than a zero, which is like ex nihilos. And the reason why I think that is that the difference between the Old Testament creation and the New Testament creation is that in the beginning, God was already existing in some potentiality, and he separated the mixture of potentiality, the light from the darkness. So there was something to begin with. He didn't create it out of nothing. I mean, it was not like God, but if he created it out of nothing, where the hell did God come from to begin with? Okay, so he did create out of nothing, but it seemed to me by the time it came to the early Christians, that ex nihilo what was an idea that there was nothing. And then I wonder whether that just came from just the word itself, or whether that came from just the idea of the dialectics. In other words, the contrast between being and nothingness. I think being and nothingness, I always thought of it, I myself personally thought of it as the nothingness was not an absolute zero, but the potentiality of becoming something. So in the terms of creation, a myth, in terms of art, is like I have this thing, I don't quite understand what it is. It's kind of like a indifferentiated thing. I'm going to create something out of it, but there's a potentiality that I bring out of the nothingness into being. Okay, that's different than if I reach into the void and pull out. Oh, there's a rabbit. Well, how surprising! I mean, I think that's a really different concept. I mean thing, because I think that has something to do with the fact that developing a concept makes it a natural thing that before there was a concept, there was nothing. There's no concept. But if you think of it in a kind of material existential way, there was always a potentiality of turning that. Well, I guess in the early Greeks, I don't understand this well enough. Matter was kind of like nothingness. It's just that the stuff that you have to give it form, right? So in some sense, I think that's a really radical change that you could create something out of nothing. Even in terms of modern science, zero. I mean, you have potentiality, and then it fluxes, and the potential comes out, and it becomes a positive energy, right? Otherwise, it just sort of negates itself under the, I guess the material divide or something, the potentiality. And as long as it eventually comes together and cancel each other into a kind of balanced system, then it goes back into potentiality. So the void of nothingness, the empty space, it's actually full of this potentiality of nothingness that is going to come out. It's not an absolute zero. So I think that's a radical change.
Yes.
Because that makes in a sense that the nothingness has to struggle with it becoming being, and it comes up to the point, it almost seems like you have to have being. I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be anything, you could, if there's nothing, there's no thought. You can't think of the nothing. You have to have something to think of the nothing. So I think that's a radical change. I don't know how that came about. I think ideas made that concept, actualize that concept somewhat. Okay, that's it. I'm a little confused on that because I think that's a very, very different way of looking at the world.
Yes.
Potentiality into something,
Yes.
or nothing into something. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, when we move on to sentences 7 through 9 of this paragraph after Stephen goes, this issue of something or nothing is going to come front and center. So thanks for bringing it up. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up a slightly different angle on crucifixion. Got to remember that we've got this Roman Empire, and your tribe, whatever it was, the slightly more Greek than the other Greeks' tribe, were all under the iron fist of this empire. The Jews, for example, well, somebody else telling us what to do was just not on. We were told we're number one in the world. And of course, let's take the example of the Jews, the Romans come along, if you cross us, up you go. You cross us, we will cross you. We put you up. And of course, this is tremendously humiliating. It's not just that you've probably got a pretty poor on the physical level living, but your pride is destroyed under the iron fist of the Romans. So your hero, Jesus or whoever, the world, the Romans, the spirit of the world exercises its power and kills your hero, Jesus, and Jesus in the end just, ha ha ha, look at me, dude. You crucified me, you put me in a tomb, I'm laughing at you. I have risen above you. So there is this other angle of the triumph of the oppressed against the oppressor. Of course, we've got to remember that dear old Emperor Donald will be soon telling us that, remember guys, the oppressed also means loser, and the oppressor also means winner. But anyway, this is the triumph of the small guy who has had nothing but been squashed
Yes.
by the worldly power of Rome. So he has to, well, dare I say, fantasize about his hero who defeats Rome. So there is this other angle. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the subversive victory not only over the emperor but over death itself. Yeah. It's an interesting transformation. You know, it's one of the things I was going to mention about sentences 4 through 6 that's relevant to this is, you know, Prometheus is all over sentences 4 through 6. He doesn't name him, but you get this. That's one of the allusions that's being made here. You talk about gods and suffering. The obvious example from Greek mythology is Prometheus' liver being torn out. But the difference is when his liver is torn out, it grows back the next day, and it doesn't. One of the things that's often left out of modern renditions of the myth, it doesn't grow back because Zeus said so. It grows back because Prometheus is a god. He's a Titan. Titans are gods. And they can't die. They're better than mortals. That's what it means to be sacred in the ancient worldview, is that it's better than mortal. It can't be mortal. It has to be better than mortal. And so his liver grows back. Having his liver torn out may be, you know, agonizing and endless because it keeps happening, but it's not death because that would make him immortal, right? And he's immortal, not mortal. And you know, partially this is here because it's about gods and suffering and it's Greek and, you know, there's Prometheus, but also because if you throw Jesus in there, you got to know that in I think it was in Otherwise, Kenneth wrote a dialogue between Jesus and Prometheus, in which during those years where nobody knows where Jesus got to, Jesus travels the world, and among other things, he goes to the Caucasus Mountains, and he sits down with Prometheus, and the two have a dialogue in which they commiserate and have compassion for one another, and, you know, make observations about the similarities and differences between their suffering. So, you know, this is this issue of the differences between the ancient and medieval concepts of suffering and God are huge. You know, that's what he's alluding to here in these sentences. Obliquely, he doesn't name him, but he does everything but name him. He does everything else he needs to do to introduce the topic is here. Donald, I see you have something on your mind. Come off mute and tell us what it is.
I'm sure it's very small.
Stop it.
But Stephen started off the session today with, I think, some comments on how sort of taking one a criticism, like a criticism by the Christians of the concepts behind hierarchy and aristocracy. They weren't really, in a way, I think Stephen is correct in that they're not in a real position to criticize conceptually. You know, in the same way, and I was thinking of the kind of thing where Kenneth's interpretation of Aesop's fable, the grasshopper and the ant, you know, and moderns all say, well, it's nothing here. It's the ants are right. The grasshopper's a freeloader. But the Kenneth's view was that a Greek Aristos would have said, it's the grasshopper who's right because he deserves to be cared for because he brings music and culture to the life of the ants. And the fact that they're dumb shits and don't realize it just proves, you know, they're like the Christians criticizing the Greeks. In the end, they don't know what they're talking about. But at the same time, versus the Romans, I think there would be some difference in that if you go around and ask people, what is justice? You'll get all kinds of answers and you can poke holes in them and you'll probably be right. But ask anybody in the history of men, have you ever been treated unjustly? And they'll know. They will know. That's a direct genomic experience. I mean, except sometimes they'll be wrong, except sometimes they got justice and didn't like it. But people will always say, no, I know when that lady down the street, when she treated me this way, she was treating me unjustly. Whatever. People will recognize, and that's actually, I think, something that the Greeks were aware of, that's a primordial, that's sort of a basic experience that leads one to a deeper understanding. I can't be being treated unjustly unless there is something that is justice. So, and we've kind of come back around to it as we move down this paragraph, and somebody on here likes Spinoza. Spinoza, he didn't use the word, the Christian gods are not immortal. And Spinoza makes that very clear. The Christian God is eternal. He is outside of time. He is also spatial. I don't know what the word is. He's outside of space. He does not exist within nature, physis. And that's quite different from being someone who will be alive for the duration of time versus someone for whom time is something other, and that's another point. I think an important thing to remember that when Christianity, they're not talking about an immortal God, talking about an eternal God. And we confuse that all the time. I got dissuaded of it studying Spinoza, but I know other people like that. But anyway, I think that's enough. That the Christians, kind of to sum up, Christians were probably not. They did a remarkable criticism of doing turnabouts fair play on the Romans, but they didn't have a deep understanding of aristocracy or what it meant. But they would have known what it meant to be ruled by a kleptography, an oligarchy. Huh?
Kleptocracy.
Kleptocracy, yeah. I'll get that center syllable in there soon enough. But yeah, and so they would have had a concrete experience to base their revolt on. Whether they, it's sort of like in modernity, Marxism. The proletariat's going to lead us out of it, except none of the Marxists were proletarians. They were all quite educated bourgeois. They weren't factory workers or anything like that. Oh well.
Thank you, Donald. So the paragraph wraps up on some of the issues you guys are talking about. A God who is so vulnerable is like a slave, a creature of too much matter. Why call him a God at all? And of course, if he says matter, right, the Greek word we're talking about here is hule, and that's the stuff from which you create. And in the Greek world, going back to what Phil was talking about, the stuff from which you create is binding upon you as a creator. A carpenter cannot do what a mason can do. A mason cannot do, what someone who works in glass can do. The matter constrains and shapes the act of creation. And so we're back to this issue of ex nihilo, ex materia, right here in sentence 7. And the issue that's being talked about is that from a cultural perspective, the Greeks believe that the douloi suffer their culture. It's a pathos for them. They are immersed in it and they become symptoms of it. They become it. They experience it and they live it naively. The Banausoi abstract themselves from their culture and systematize it, but only the Aristoi actually create culture. This is the definition of these types. If they don't create culture, they're not Aristoi. And the culture they create isn't just I sang a song, so I'm a culture bearer. It has to be working mythos. It has to be changing the way that we see the world to make it possible to find Sophrosune. And if they do that, then they're Aristoi. And if they don't do that, then they're not Aristoi, regardless of what they call themselves or how many swords they have to send to beat you up. So for them, this issue of form and matter is also reflected in their structural hierarchy. So that the Aristos is a creature that is attempting to impose new form upon the hule of culture. And among other things, that means upon the douloi and the Banausoi, who are slaves, because they can't transcend their culture. The doulos can't transcend his culture, and the Banausos can't move it in the direction of health, only in the direction of abstract systematization. So, to be that vulnerable, to have that little autarkia, autonomia, that you can be crucified, is to suffer pathos in the way that a slave suffers pathos. And so to the Greeks, it's like, it can't be a god, because a god is supposed to be better than an Aristos, not worse than an Aristos. And you're depicting a person who's suffering like a doulos. So how can this be a god? So this is what he's tying in all this stuff of ex nihilo and ex materia into this ancient frustration with the Christian concept that Jesus is a god. To the ancients, even the gods in their highest states are still natural and subject to the laws and course of the regime of fate, Ananke or Moira, right? But the Christian father is neither of these, like Donald was saying, the eternal, outside of space and time, able to create ex nihilo. And I blame John for that more than Genesis, by the way, going back to Phil's comments about where does this come from. It comes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. This is abstracting far further from Genesis. And Genesis's creation is a lot more, as you pointed out, Phil, it's a lot more ex materia. John is a lot more ex nihilo. That's the one-upsmanship, right, of the early church fathers. Our God is more of a God than your God, and then they do it through abstraction. But the Christian father is neither of these. And of course, all talk of the power to create and the created world violates the most primal order of a self-evolved, self-continuous nature that presupposes itself back into abysmal eternity, right? Heraclitus, this universe is neither created nor will be destroyed, but always was and ever shall be an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. He says there's transformations of energy, and the cosmos is essentially eternal. This is the Greek concept, which Heraclitus is not inventing, but attempting to put into words, right? And he's drawing this from the Eleusinian mysteries, which are drawing it from the depths of Greek daimonic religion. And in all of this is this concept that the gods are certainly not eternal, because they're reflections of nature. They're immortal, not eternal, as Donald said. That's a great characterization. And they're not even always the dominant gods. There are successive generations of gods. The Titans aren't the top dogs anymore in the world, even though they are gods and they're still around. They're not dead. They're immortal. But they've been replaced by the Olympians. And there are recurring motifs throughout the Greek myths that the Olympians' day too is numbered, and sooner or later other gods will replace them. Dionysus, that Dio is like Zeus. Zeus is older. The older Indo-European version of Zeus is a DZ sound, and in the case of Zeus, the D is dropped. In the case of Dionysus, the Z is dropped. Dionysus is the new god. He's the one who's going to replace Zeus. It's right there in his name. And the Greeks read him that way, right? This is the new up and coming, religion that's that's still part of the Greek religion, but it's going to be a new generation. And then you've got, you've got various divinities who are doing away with, like Saturn, doing away with his children because he knows the prophecy that he's going to be replaced. So this concept of generations of deities, is well entrenched in the Greek religion, and it's based on the idea that only nature is eternal. So the idea that nature is created and has a creator violates the core Greek concept of an eternal nature. It says there wasn't a nature, and then some dude with a white beard made one. He thought it was a good idea. And he did it exactly the way he wanted to, however he wanted to do it, from nothing. Or not from nothing, depending on whether you're reading Genesis or John. But in any case, I think paragraph 13 does a lovely job of really putting head to head how opposed these concepts of nature and God and man's place within that framework are from the ancient world to the medieval world. They're not only incompatible, but another word that Kenneth likes to use from time to time, they're incompossible. They can't both be possible at the same time. They are worldviews that can never be reconciled to each other. One must simply replace the other. You could have neither, or you could have one, but you couldn't have both. So this is paragraph 13, and I hope you have enjoyed today's session as much as I have. But he's setting us up for paragraph 14, where he's gonna do this again. Another is a 1-2 punch here with 13 and 14, really exploring how alien these two epochs are to each other, which makes it all the more astonishing that the medieval grew up in the ruins and shadow of the first one and had to overcome it. And it's remarkable. It's a mutation, he calls it in paragraph 13. That's just right on the money. So I hope y'all have a great week. Have a good one. See you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.